The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 976. Same people but different fates. At the same time, rumors about the French raising ogres in the army and liking to eat human hands and feet also spread within the German allied forces. Maximum Weissmann's crazy look gives people every reason to believe that he must have seen some too exciting scene to become like this. Priests took this opportunity to trumpet the sanctity of this war, that they were fighting the devil and doing the will of God. Nationalists jump out to preach that resisting national oppression and rescuing compatriots are selfless and just acts. The propaganda machine of the Austrian Empire sang praises for the country and the royal family, promoting the correctness of the country's actions and the greatness of the royal family. In fact, Franz also wanted to visit the military camps one by one like other time travelers and even have a drink with everyone. However, the Austrian army's barracks was so big that he couldn't finish it, even if he walked all night. Not to mention 150,000 glasses of wine. Even using a 142-gram small cup adds up to 21.3 tons in the end. He could only symbolically visit 15 military camps and took a series of historic pictures while being surrounded by people. But even this took him a full 8 hours. And it was already 3 o'clock in the morning when Franz returned to his camp. The intense fatigue made him fall asleep. Several ladies who accompanied him all night were expecting something to happen, but they were asked out of the temporary house by 2 maids on the grounds that it might interfere with the Grand Duke's rest. However, for these ladies, being able to travel with the Crown Prince of the Austrian Empire is already a capital. In addition, it is so dark and so late, it is completely reasonable for them to be jealous as for why Franz had to bring these flies that he didn't like. The answer is to do as the Romans do. An aristocratic young man of Franz's age would be considered incompetent if he was not surrounded by ladies or mistresses. It's not that his family can't do it, it's that he himself can't do it. At this time, the Austrian Empire was booming. If Franz traveled without 2 famous ladies, on the one hand, he would become the talk of the upper class after dinner, and on the other hand, the person who came to court Franz next time might no longer be a beautiful woman, but a handsome man. Unlike Franz, who was always merciful, Archduke Albrecht and his army had nationalism in their minds at this time, and showed no mercy to the main force of La Massilia in Salzburg. La Massilia felt that Albrecht's troops were not many, and he occupied a favorable terrain. Even if he could not win, there would be no problem in holding the fortress. However, in the first head-on confrontation between the 2 sides, he knew that his troops would not be able to defeat the army in front of him in an encounter facing the pursuit of the coalition forces. La Massilia did much better than Bonneau di Cullen. Instead of wasting his precious cavalry to block the gap, he sent out a war team to directly separate those who could not escape the pursuit from his main force. The abandoned French troops naturally had only one fate, and that was death. The nationalist wars of this era were even more cruel than the wars of the barbaric era. Especially those soldiers who were deeply influenced by nationalism saw their compatriots who were helping the elderly and young to escape, as well as those who had stayed for several days and left with corpses and wounded soldiers. After becoming brothers, their blood has already been ignited. Take prisoners, non-existent. They just want to kill each other or be killed by each other. All the French soldiers who fell on the battlefield were stabbed to prevent them from pretending to be dead or not fully dead. La Massilia's decisiveness allowed him to lose only a small number of troops, so he was still confident in holding Salzburg. Since both sides marched in secret, there were no military observers from other countries in the armies of both sides. Salzburg. Listening to the constant sound of heavy artillery outside, La Massilia suddenly felt that his M1841 6-pound Napoleon field gun was no longer good. The Austrians' heavy artillery is so powerful. La Massilia's army suffered 2 defeats in a row. At this time, the command system was almost full of new faces, more than half of whom had died in the previous attack. The Austrians' cannons are all copied from ours. Those are just scrap metal. They're just loud. If you like it, Marshal, I will send someone to steal a few doors when it gets dark. Blind arrogance and following the crowd were caused by the bureaucratic atmosphere of the Second French Republic at this time. La Massilia could only sigh helplessly. He still missed his old subordinates. These newcomers only talked about insignificant big words and empty words, but no matter what, as long as he holds Salzburg, then he will at least have the merit of regaining Lorraine, and at least he will still be a hero of France. The coalition's artillery shells and rockets poured into the ruins of Salzburg, as if they were free, and the French army's main 6-pounder had no chance to fight back. La Massilia had made up his mind to develop larger caliber field artillery to adapt to the new battlefield environment after this war. Your Excellency, Marshal, the continuous bombardment by the German allied forces has caused a lot of casualties to our army. More importantly, the morale of the soldiers is also very low. La Massilia looked at the staff officer with a worried look on his face and said, "Young man, I know you are scared, but the Germans have no wings and they cannot cross us. As long as we stay here, Lorraine is ours for the glory of the Second French Republic. We must hold on until the very end," the staff officer still said with some concern. But, according to intelligence from Italy, the Austrians have indeed mastered a flying weapon, and it has been confirmed by the Papal State. Pope Pius IX himself even gave him the title of Archangel of Slaughter. La Massilia couldn't help laughing after hearing this. If you listen to those magicians, you might as well believe that Pius IX is the spokesperson of God. They just like to use gods and ghosts to deceive the stupid people. I suggest you read more Nature and Science, which can keep you away from those magicians. Aren't these two magazines Austrian publications? The young staff officer asked with some confusion. La Massilia could only smile awkwardly. As long as it's useful to us, it doesn't matter which country it's a magazine from. Anyway, Austrians can fly and die. La Massilia don't believe it. However, what La Massilia didn't know was that, just when he thought he was holding Salzburg impregnably, small units of the German allied forces had already circled behind him. The Swiss expeditionary force of the Second French Republic only had more than 20,000 people, but Emanuele Pellissier felt that he could at least reach Tyrol. After all, according to the previous records of French military observers in Switzerland, the so-called Swiss Civil War was not even a fight between rookies, but simply a war between indigenous tribes. Apart from being bloody and cruel, it is almost useless. No French military cadet would fight such a stupid battle. An army of hundreds of thousands of people was actually being thrown around by tens of thousands of people. His elite troops must be far superior to the Austrians' motley troops. Chapter 977 The Adventures of Emanuele Pellissier. Lieutenant General Emanuele Pellissier initially planned to enter Switzerland directly from the Roches Pass, but the Prussian barbarians were more difficult to communicate with than he imagined. Lieutenant General Emanuele Pellissier originally wanted to use his official authority to show off his prestige and ask the Prussian guards at Roches Pass to find someone qualified to negotiate with him. By coincidence, Prince William happened to be in the mountain pass fortress. As a result, Emanuele Pellissier had to stand and be scolded for a long time, and then retreated to France in embarrassment. Even the Iron Madman would not dare to confront the famous Prince of Shotgun. Prince William, later the German Emperor William I, was at the lowest point in his life. Dissatisfied with William IV's weak attitude towards the revolutionaries, Prince William went to the guard station to incite officers and soldiers to suppress the rebellion in Berlin. Unlike the 3 days in history, this generation of Prince William fought against the people of Berlin for a full week. Hundreds of people died in this series of conflicts, but the outcome remained the same. King William IV of Prussia still chose to compromise and drove his brother Prince William out of Berlin as punishment. Although it was punishment on the surface, it was actually a way of protecting William IV for his younger brother. After all, there were too many radical nationalists in Berlin at this time, and maybe one day these people would do something when their heads got hot. And his younger brother, Prince William, is not an easy man either. The more someone wants to assassinate him, the more he has to go to a crowded place. So William IV sent his brother back to his fiefdom. Prince William didn't like to stay idle in this small valley in Switzerland point, so he began to transform the entire fief according to his own wishes, and the defense of Roches Pass was the focus of his transformation point. The Roches Pass is an important passage to and from France, but the Nasjitter and Swiss governments obviously did not pay enough attention to it in the past point. The so-called Roches fortress has not been rebuilt since it was destroyed by Napoleon. There are only 38 soldiers in the entire fortress, most of whom are old, weak, sick and disabled. Point after Prince William came to the Prussian enclave in Switzerland, Neuchâtel and Jura, he began to reorganize regional defense. Point Roches fortress was the first to bear the brunt. The ancient fortress was renovated, and an anti-cannon slope was even built in front of the fortress in accordance with the latest military concepts. The troop strength also increased from 38 men to 1 battalion, with a total of 527 men. While Prince William was inspecting his territory, he actually heard that a French officer was leading a troop to enter Neuchâtel with a very arrogant attitude. Prince William naturally vented all the resentment he had accumulated over the past few days on Prussia. In fact, Prussia originally wanted to be more tough, but when he saw the other party, his attitude was surprisingly tough. The main problem is that he is not a fool. With such a dangerous location, such a fortress, and such a commander, although the opponent only has 1 battalion, if the opponent is determined to fight to the end, then his entire expeditionary force will surely suffer heavy losses. As a result, Iron Madman Prussia could only return the same way in embarrassment, after being sprayed by Prince shot. At the same time, the Austrian gunners who were ambushing in the mountains also breathed a sigh of relief, because once the Prussians let the French army enter Neuchâtel, Austria would have to give them a reason to go to war. After this encounter, Prussia learned the lesson, and decided to invade Valais directly through Lake Geneva. Taking the Valais can support Bellevue's invasion of the Kingdom of Sardinia from the flank. Unfortunately, Valais has a fleet. Although the total tonnage is only more than 2,000 tons, which is not as heavy as a third-class battleship, they are invincible in Lake Geneva. It is naturally impossible for the transport ships temporarily commandeered by Prussia's expeditionary force to fight against warships, and it is even less possible for the French army to fight against professional naval forces on the water. Iron Madman Prussia returned home defeated again. This time he not only lost nearly 1,000 soldiers, but also lost almost all of France's water power on Lake Geneva. 2 consecutive defeats have made Prussia increasingly testy, suggested his aide-de-camp can't. Your Majesty General, maybe we can attack Fribourg first. Fribourg? That is an important military location, and according to intelligence there are at least 10,000 regular troops there. Prussia was not entirely convinced by his adjutant's advice. Kant continued, it is said that the people there are very timid. In the previous Swiss Civil War, only a few people were killed before surrendering. What's more important is that the local people have admired me for a long time, France, and even the language they use in daily life is French. By occupying Fribourg, we not only occupied an important military area with good connections in all directions, but also obtained a logistics base that can replenish troops at any time. Even if the locals are timid and fearful, there should be no problem in temporarily requisitioning them as a transportation team. The location of Fribourg is indeed very important. If you occupy it, you can attack Neuchâtel to the north and Bern to the east. Moreover, the idea of supporting war with war was deeply rooted in the hearts of France at this time, and almost all French generals would unconsciously think of enemy supplies before the battle. Prussia was very sure that, if he fired a few cannons, and if it was no longer possible, he would shout twice and the Fribourg garrison would surrender. However, the reality is that after suffering months of inhuman torture during the Swiss Civil War, the soldiers and civilians of Fribourg hated surrender. During the Swiss Civil War, Fribourg was the first Orthodox Union state to surrender, so it was forced to bear the military expenses of the Free Alliance during the several months of civil war due to the protracted war and rampant graft and corruption within the Free Alliance. By the end of the war, Fribourg's tax revenue even reached 150 times what it was before the war. What's even more frightening is that this influence lasted until the war. It was impossible for the people of Fribourg to have the money to pay the 150 times the tax point. So Joseph Loy, then Prime Minister of the Free Alliance, gave a loan to every resident of Fribourg, which they would need to repay even after the war, not to mention that during the previous civil war, almost every family in Fribourg starved to death. If they were asked to surrender in Kaching at this time, they would not be willing even if they were killed. The terrain in Switzerland is indeed suitable for holding on. Even if the French army has better equipment and higher quality soldiers, it will not take advantage of it. 2 weeks passed in the blink of an eye, but they still couldn't make any progress. Pelissier was so angry that he tore up his battle plan to pieces. According to his pre-war estimates, he should at least reach Argos by this time. At this time, Major General Kant put forward new suggestions. Your Excellency Lieutenant General, we are here to promote French democracy and freedom, not to kill. So I think we should use more peaceful means to save the poor people from the hands of the tyrant. Chapter 978, The Adventures of Eminable Pelissier. Pelissier's brows immediately relaxed after hearing this. After all, this method sounded very feasible. France was once the beacon of democracy in Europe. Moreover, this is completely in line with the propaganda of the Second French Republic, and I believe that the gentleman in Paris will not say anything more. Major General Kant, who swaggered into Fribourg, thought that his long speech could persuade the defenders of Fribourg to surrender immediately. The results turned out to be exactly the opposite of what he thought. Although Count Chambord was not a hero, his strong moral obsession made his actual performance much better than those governors before Fribourg who only knew how to enrich themselves and use their power for personal gain. The Count of Chambord was not without ability. He was very talented in architecture and urban design. In addition, the strength of the Orthodox faction in France is not weak. So when they heard that the Count of Chambord had become the Duke of Fribourg, many loyal ministers of the Orthodox faction in the minority who were unsuccessful in France, chose to come to Fribourg. Major General Kant's remarks were simply treasonous to them, but these nobles from France were restrained, and at most they only uttered a few vulgar words. As a supporter of the Second French Republic, Major General Kant naturally could not be ignored, so the two sides kept talking back and forth. Originally, this matter should have ended with Major General Kant being driven out of the fortress, but the Swiss mountain people did not care about this. They directly crucified Major General Kant, who was about to return to the battlefield in a heroic manner, like an animal. Behaviors like this, that violate the agreed upon rules of war, usually boost the morale of one's own side. However, at this time, Pelissier's expeditionary force had lost its spirit, and the soldiers were completely indifferent to the tragic death of this officer. Pelissier couldn't help but become even more angry when he saw such soldiers, but he also knew that Fribourg could not continue to fight. If he continued to fight, he would get nothing but more casualties on the Italian battlefield. Bellevue conquered the Kingdom of Sardinia in just 7 days, something that neither party had expected before the war began. At first, everyone thought Bellevue's army was a joke. No matter how many people there were, they would have no use in the long mountain road. The Kingdom of Sardinia has an army of 100,000, and as long as 1/10 of it is packed into the valley fortress, even if Napoleon is reborn, there will be nothing he can do. Unless they followed Hannibal's example and crossed the Alps, but that was almost impossible. Even if they had the courage to cross over, they would not have enough time. So how did Bellevue conquer the Kingdom of Sardinia? In fact, the French army did not experience any decent battle when they entered the Kingdom of Sardinia. Although Carlo Alberto escaped by repeatedly jumping horizontally through the traditional Italian skills, he offended more than just Austria and the Papal States. In fact, Carlo Alberto also offended all the nationalists and radical republicans in the country. Coupled with the inability to pay war reparations, which resulted in a large number of prisoners of war stranded abroad, and the excessive expropriation at home, he offended all the people at home. So when Bellevue led the army of the Second Republic to the border of Sardinia, the defenders chose to sacrifice the fortress without even thinking about it. You must know that France was the beacon of democracy in Europe at that time, and the Second French Republic was the utopia in the minds of European democrats and the bourgeoisie at that time. The army of the Kingdom of Sardinia that dedicated the fortress joined Bellevue's expeditionary force in the blink of an eye. After all, their purpose was not just to free themselves, but to liberate all oppressed Italians with these leading parties. Bellevue captured Turin without any bloodshed, and even Carlo Alberto's palace guards rebelled. They wanted to capture Carlo Alberto and present it to General Bellevue as a gift of thanks for liberating the Kingdom of Sardinia. Fortunately, there were still 3 pounds of nails in the ruined ship. Carlo Alberto escaped to Milan under the desperate protection of his loyal guards. Northern Italian theater, Milan. The old Marshal Radetzky was listening to Carlo Alberto's hysterical chatter. Next to the old marshal stood a pretty and lovely girl who was his great-granddaughter Celia. The girl looked at the embarrassed Carlo Alberto, the panicked entourage, and her grandfather, and sighed at the same time. It's not that they were impatient, nor did they disrespect the king. It was just that his words were completely missing the point. The 82-year-old Marshal Radetzky did not want to continue to waste his precious life. So he wanted to send Carlo Alberto and others to the temporarily vacated manor to rest. Marshal Radetzky, the French have already invaded the border. It's not safe here. There are 300,000 of them. No, it's 400,000. It's 500,000. The city of Milan will definitely not be able to defend it. Let's go to Venice quickly. No, let's go to Vienna. Escape to Vienna and we will be safe. Carlo Alberto roared hysterically, and the entourage on the side also said, His Majesty is the king, the brother of the Austrian emperor. We need a safer place to stay. Theoretically, all royal members in Europe are related by blood, and kings should be treated as brothers. The new mayor of Milan, Archduke Leon, looked at his old superior, Marshal Radetzky, who nodded. Although Grand Duke Leon was not an excellent soldier, it was unrealistic to exclude him from the inner circle, based on his qualifications and family influence. Simply under Franz's secret operation, the second in command in the northern Italian theater became the mayor of Milan. Your Majesty, please come this way. The Grand Duke of Leon politely asked Carlo Alberto and his party to leave the room, leaving only the two of them to explain what happened in the Kingdom of Sardinia. However, what they said was not very nutritious. They only knew that the French were very powerful, they were marching very fast, and their troops were very large, but they didn't know the details once they got their point. In fact, Austria also has an intelligence network in the Kingdom of Sardinia, but the French army occupied the Kingdom of Sardinia too fast this time, so the intelligence sent back was also very confusing. But one thing is certain, that the French army has at least 300,000 troops, which is fully double the previous estimate of 150,000. Soon Marshal Radetzky invited the two Carlo Alberto's entourages out, and then a middle-aged man came in from the outside. Celia, who was accompanying Marshal Radetzky, tilted her head and looked at the uncle in front of her. This was the most valued subordinate of her grandfather. Looks a little shy, Celia commented, and Marshal Radetzky patted his great-granddaughter on the head lovingly. Little ghost and elf, let's go out and play. Grandpa Zoo wants to talk about business. After hearing this, the girl jumped away and made a face. When she passed Colonel Benedek. The girl gently closed the door, and finally only Benedek and Radetzky were left in the room. Colonel Benedek, you should be aware of the situation now. If you were me at this time, how would you like to deal with it? As Marshal Radetzky's most favored junior, Benedek was also the commander-in-chief of the Austrian Northern Army in the history of the Austro-Prussian War. Naturally, he had his own unique insights. Even Radetzky nodded as he elaborated on his strategy, but at the end he let out a long sigh. Chapter 979. Convinced, Benedek knew the defense of northern Italy well, and knew the loopholes in every defense. He could even name the garrison officer of each fortress. He also knew very well that, even if the French army really had 300,000 people, the two sides would just be back on the same starting line. Northern Italy originally had a heavy stockpile of troops, coupled with wartime expansion and the large number of new soldiers recruited by the Austrian government after the Great Restoration War. To solve the problem of refugees and unemployment, the Austrian Empire also had 300,000 troops in the Italian theater at this time. Strictly speaking, Bellevue, the enemy's commander, was not a general in the traditional sense. He was worse than those aristocratic generals who had never been on the battlefield. Bellevue played more of a secretary role in the French army. If it had not been for the outbreak of the February Revolution, He would never have been able to command a large army alone in his life. Only this kind of person would come up with such a crazy strategy of 5 groups coming out together and be willing to concentrate the main force to attack from the direction of the Kingdom of Sardinia. If Carlo Alberto had not rejected the Austrian Empire's offer of assistance at the beginning of the war, the French would still be lingering on the border between the two countries. Of course, it was reasonable for Carlo Alberto to reject the Austrian Empire's proposal. After all, no ruler would want other countries' armies to enter their land. In addition to its powerful troops, Bellevue's army also has a staff group recruited from the St. C Military Academy. These people will undoubtedly be a big trouble. Benedek was right about other aspects such as weapons and equipment, but Marshal Radetzky still felt very sorry. Benedek was indeed one of the best officers in northern Italy and even the entire Austrian Empire at this time. However, the vision is still too low. All I know is that blindly defending lacks the general spirit of a big country. As for having a low vision, there is nothing to be done about it. After all, there are too few wars in this era, and there are almost no super powerful enemies. If you spend all day pecking at each other with these novices in Italy for a long time, you will inevitably have a narrow vision. Mr. Colonel, your defense is indeed impregnable, but what if the French choose to concentrate their forces and attack only one point? Marshal Radetzky didn't want to hurt the young man's self-esteem, so he adopted this more tactful approach. If this were the East of the same era, an officer in his 40s, who had been in the military for many years, would have knelt down to thank his mentor if he had received such a suggestion from his old boss. But at this time, Benedek was still talking endlessly about strategic defense, such as mobile defense. The railway lines of the Austrian Empire provided the possibility of mobile defense, but this was still very passive in the eyes of Marshal Radetzky. He couldn't help but interrupt Colonel Benedek's tirade. Mr. Colonel, maybe we can consider attacking the enemy's rear directly and cutting off the enemy's supplies. In this way, we may be able to win at a lower cost. The old marshal thought that the other party would suddenly realize it and change his overly conservative thinking. However, Benedek's answer surprised the old marshal. Your Excellency, Marshal, our country has not declared war on the Kingdom of Sardinia. Our troops cannot enter the territory of the Kingdom of Sardinia without authorization. Radetzky was speechless. This is easy to handle. Just ask His Majesty the King to write us a statement soon. But this, nothing. Good. Did the French inform them before attacking the Kingdom of Sardinia? Your Majesty Marshal, according to our intelligence network, the French did submit a declaration of war before attacking the Kingdom of Sardinia. Benedek's words left the old marshal speechless for a while, but Radetzky finally chose to give up. Mr. Benedek, please obey the order. Yes, Marshal. Just give the order. Benedek saluted with a serious expression. Then, Mr. Benedek, I need you to lead a force deep into the Kingdom of Sardinia to block Bellevue's supplies and the French army's retreat. Marshal Radetzky pointed at the map. Genoa? Benedek asked in confusion. But the main force of the French army is clearly preparing for a decisive battle with our army on the line of the Tos River. The Tos River, a tributary of the Po River, is located in northwest Italy, on the dividing line between Piedmont and Lombardy. Who said that the French army would fight us on the line of the Tos River? Did Bellevue tell you? The old marshal finally looked a little sulky. Not only did the main force of the French army gather along the Tokay River, but our army's intelligence also showed that a large number of French troops appeared near the Tokay River. Moreover, the main force of the Kingdom of Sardinia also chose to fight our army here. Benedek is still trying to explain his logic, which is a very bad habit of his. Due to his background, Benedek was both proud and inferior, because he could not afford even one failure, but many people could decide his fate with just one sentence. If Benedek was allowed to reflect carefully, maybe he would be able to think of it after a while, but the old marshal couldn't wait any longer. What you see is just what the enemy wants you to see. According to the intelligence, it is a joke that Bellevue leads the troops, but I can tell you that the enemy's arrangement is very thorough. I'm afraid that the French have been preparing this offensive plan for many years. The victory or defeat is indeed decided by the Battle of Tos River, but the key to this battle is not on the front line of Tos River, but Genoa. the Ligurian Pass to be exact. Point: the French can directly attack our rear through here, and we can also directly attack the enemy's rear through here. Benedek still couldn't understand. Your Excellency, Marshal, I can understand that the French can attack our rear through the Ligurian Pass. But the French's rear is in Turin, so what's the point of us occupying Genoa? We need the French rear in Turin, not in Genoa. This is an order from the High Command, a joint general staff, and the colonel carries it out. Yes, Your Excellency. Marshal Benedek was a qualified officer, but his strategic vision was still somewhat poor. In other words, most Austrian officers of this generation lack strategic vision, but the royal family has produced many talents. For example, the strategy of setting Turin as the French rear area was very clever, and it was Franz who proposed this strategy. Point: the French army's strategy of relying on food to defeat the enemy is indeed very clever, and democracy and freedom can indeed confuse people's hearts, but when put together, the two are a bit nondescript. Point: in order to resolve the threat from the Kingdom of Sardinia once and for all, and recover the war reparations owed by Carlo Alberto, Archduke Franz's strategy was definitely the most brilliant approach. Point: at the same time, according to the estimates of Archduke Franz and the General Staff, the French army is very likely to use its maritime advantages to transport supplies and soldiers to the front line. In other words, the French army can only quickly send supplies and soldiers to the front line through sea channels, so the key to this war will be the battle for Genoa. Point: Turin, Royal Palace of Sardinia. Point: in fact, without Franz's inducement at all, Bellevue set Turin as his rear area. Point: Bellevue himself and his staff even lived directly in the palace. Although the Turin Palace could not compare with those palaces in Paris, the centuries-old accumulation of the Kingdom of Sardinia still made their eyes shine. Point: not to mention that the French army entered Turin in the image of a victor and savior. At this time, Turin people and even all Piedmontese regarded the French army as heroes. The French army's momentum and reputation are naturally inseparable from the leading parties and progressives in the Kingdom of Sardinia. Point: of course, this is also due to the influence of the French Revolution, which made France a beacon for the whole of Europe, giving them a large number of fans and spiritual French people all over Europe. Point: when the French army marched to the front line of the Tox River, they received a warm welcome from the Sardinian people. The recruitment stations set up by the French army along the way were all overcrowded. Point: everyone believed that the French army could replicate Napoleon's miracle, but Bellevue's staff were frowning because Austria's military strength in Italy far exceeded their imagination, and there was no doubt that they must have encountered it. The main force of the Austrian army. The most terrifying thing is that due to the decline of the Kingdom of Sardinia and previous wars, almost all important strongholds on the Austrian-Saharan border are in the hands of Austria, which makes the French army's strategy very passive. Point: the most reasonable tactic became a decisive battle along the Tos River, but the existence of the river put the attacker in a very disadvantageous situation. Point: before the war began, Bellevue's staff thought of bypassing the Ligurian Pass and sneaking into the rear of the Austrian Empire. For this purpose, they specially recruited 20 transport ships from the navy. Point: but even so, the Austrians blocked the Ligurian Pass before them, and the war once again reached a stalemate. Point: it is impossible for Bellevue's experts who are familiar with war history and have rich theoretical knowledge to choose to attack rashly. After all, in their opinion, this lacks the beauty of the art of war. In the end, they only came to one conclusion: wait, don't we have anything better to do? Bellevue didn't want to wait, he wanted to continue to create miracles. If he could win Milan, maybe he could win Vienna, and then return home with a great victory, calm down the chaos, and then become the chief consul, or even the first citizen. Point: however, the staff's cold answers shattered his illusions. No. According to the battlefield situation at this time, we are at a disadvantage. Unless you plan to fight an uncertain battle. Bellevue could only sigh helplessly, but it was already a good achievement for him to occupy the Kingdom of Sardinia. Point: if he didn't meet the main force of the Austrian Empire, he would definitely be able to fight to Vienna. Point: but even though he comforted himself like this, Bellevue still couldn't hide his disappointment. Point: at this time, the chief staff officer changed his subject. However, Austria's main force cannot always be at a stalemate with us. After all, we have 5 armies. When the Austrian side is in danger, they will have to fight us decisively. Point: So we just need to build fortifications and wait for the enemy to come and die. Bellevue's brows immediately relaxed after hearing this. He was an outsider in marching and fighting, so he relied heavily on these experts from the St. C Military Academy. Bellevue believed in their words even more. If what they encountered was really the main force of the Austrian Empire, then the analysis of these experts from the St. C Military Academy was not wrong. Chapter 980 The Safest Place. A month ago. Province of Lombardy, Brescia. 2 Very strange people came to the Austrian Empire's recruit camp. A lame man with a full beard and a guy who could tell from his appearance that he was clearly not European. The new military camp opened in Brescia was more like a refugee camp than a military camp, and Franz also clearly told the officials responsible for its execution that their mission was to minimize the number of refugees and beggars at this time. Stabilizing people's hearts and reducing unstable factors in society is the first priority. As for the so-called recruits, they still have to undergo training, and only those who finally pass the examination can become soldiers of the Austrian Empire. Those who are unqualified will be re-entered into society in batches at a suitable time, or sent to the colonies. Therefore, the officials responsible for the implementation set the threshold for recruits very low. The entire recruit camp had everything from toothless old men in their 50s to toothless teenagers in their 7 or 8 years. The average life expectancy at that time was only more than 30 years old, so those in their 50s could definitely be considered old people. As for the so-called toothless old man, because the underlying food at that time was very rough, the wear and tear on the teeth was also very serious. In addition, people basically do not protect their teeth, and they lack daily necessities to protect their teeth. However, the lame man and the foreigner were still a bit difficult for the officials and sergeants in charge to accept. There was enough food in the Austrian Empire's warehouses, and the army's barracks were large enough, but these two people were too mixed up. It's just a waste of food. Oh God, can we really get qualified recruits? Baron Marcello, who was in charge of recruiting new soldiers, finally couldn't bear it anymore, and Sergeant Baron beside him was also helpless. The latter certainly knew what the former meant, but there was no precedent for shutting people out. However, he decided to make things difficult for these two people for the time being. He asked as slowly as possible in what he thought was very standard Italian. What did you do in the past? Where are you from? India? Or a little further east? Neither Baron Marcello nor Sergeant Baron had seen Indians, or in other words, few people in the entire Lombardy region had seen living Indians at this time. Baron Marcello and Sergeant Baron were both educated and knowledgeable people, so it was natural for them to regard the two people in front of them as Orientals, but the answer was unexpected. The bearded man answered them in a standard Sicilian accent. We're from Sicily, which is a lot sunnier, so my kids have dark skin. Baron Marcello and Sergeant Baron looked at the two of them carefully for a while, and felt that they did look a bit European. What did you do in the past? Why are you here? We are hunters. We were forcibly recruited by the king's army in our hometown. After that, the army was disbanded, and we were left here. The bearded man answered very calmly. There was no problem with his answer. This situation was very common. King Ferdinando II of the Two Sicilies directly disbanded his army in the mountains of central Italy in order to save money. These civilians, who were trapped by the army and revolutionaries, suddenly lost their purpose. They had neither money nor food, and could only wander aimlessly. So when the Austrian Empire announced its recruitment of new soldiers, many people chose to join the army. However, this bearded man was too calm. As a civilian, he did not feel any panic at all when seeing officials and sergeants. Who are you? Baron Marcello's tone suddenly became cold, and Sergeant Baron was a little surprised, because this official from Vienna usually had no airs, and was very kind to others. What happened today? The bearded man's answer remained calm. We are hunters. I do not believe. Baron Marcello roared. You're a spy for the French. Faced with doubts, the bearded man just shrugged, while the thin man beside him was a little confused. Dear sir, we are indeed just Sicilian hunters. Impossible. How could two civilians not be afraid? The bearded man smiled and said, Sir, we hunters are used to seeing life and death, so we are not afraid. Sergeant Baron, have your men search him and see what he has on him. As Soon as he finished speaking, a dozen soldiers immediately surrounded him. Seeing this, the bearded man had no choice but to stand up. Put your hands behind your back, the soldier shouted loudly, and the thin man and the bearded man looked at each other and stepped aside. The soldiers soon found a dagger from the bearded man's waist and a dagger from his boots. There is nothing unusual about the two daggers. It is normal for hunters to carry hunting knives with them, not to mention that the current security has not stabilized yet. But Baron Marcello was obviously not satisfied with the result. Keep searching. Search carefully. The soldiers tore open the man's clothes, revealing his powerful body. The soldiers had seen many strong men, but they had never seen anyone with so many scars on their body. Countless scars, large and small, are densely covered on the man's strong body. Every scar on it is enough to make a man stand in awe. If scars are a man's mettle, then the bearded man in front of him must have outstanding achievements. Such a man may not be afraid, even if he faces death, let alone a low-level civil servant. The soldiers stopped what they were doing, and Sergeant Baron immediately stood up and walked over to the bearded man and saluted him with a military salute. "Welcome, brother. We need talents like you." The bearded man's name is Giuseppe, and he has no surname. This situation of having only a first name, but no surname was not uncommon in Europe at this time. Giuseppe's marksmanship was very accurate, and coupled with the scars accumulated on his body for 20 years, he was quickly promoted to sergeant. The thin man who entered the military camp with him also had excellent marksmanship. Both of them could use muskets to hit the mark with perfect accuracy at a distance of 50 meters. These two people were actually Garibaldi and his wife Anita. Under the dual influence of the high bounty of the Austrian Empire and the demise of the Fourth Roman Republic, Garibaldi was shamelessly betrayed and continuously hunted. If they weren't really extraordinary, they would have died in some unknown corner long ago. Because of the scars accumulated on his body for 20 years, no one dared to mess with Sergeant Giuseppe. But that thin man with tanned skin and weird appearance often becomes the target of some bad guys. However, the reality is that it is possible for the two characteristics of being thin and strong to appear in the same person at the same time. The female warrior from the Amazon can always beat the teeth of the guy who is looking for trouble. But overall, the days in the Austrian military camp were the happiest days they had spent in years. At least they don't have to deal with the kind of life and death battles every day. The so-called military training is like playing house to them, and even those who are provoking trouble seem so friendly. Being hunted has long been a common occurrence for Garibaldi. After all, he spent more than half of his life being hunted and had a bounty on his head. For him, the most dangerous place at this time was the safest place. After all, no one would have thought that they were hiding in the military camp of the Austrian Empire. Chapter 981 Old Bastard. Compared with being unpopular in the Fourth Republic of Rome, Garibaldi was respected in the Austrian recruit camp, and his officers appreciated him even more. The food was also far superior to that of Rome and the Rio Grande Republic before. At least he finally got to eat the delicacies of his hometown, fish soup macaroni. Although it felt a bit strange to be made of carp, he couldn't help but shed tears. Garibaldi has not eaten this dish for more than 10 years, and he does not even dare to contact his family because he is afraid of harming them. The family thought he was dead, and Garibaldi thought of the stooped figure of his mother who had worked hard to raise him, and his younger siblings. Garibaldi's father was a brave sailor and a drunkard who spent almost all the money he earned in taverns. At the age of 10, Garibaldi had to become a trainee sailor on the Constanta. Although he received almost no salary, he was responsible for the food. This was enough for Garibaldi at the time. The first turning point in his life was when he was 13 years old, when a group of pirates attacked the merchant ship he was on. The sailors resisted desperately, but were still outnumbered. However, the reason why the legend is a legend lies in his experience and courage that surpass ordinary people. Garibaldi, who was only 13 years old, killed the arrogant pirate leader with a dagger in a fight, and then used the gun in the pirate leader's hand to kill the mole mate on the ship. The remaining pirates saw that the situation was bad and fled one after another. The captain was grateful to Garibaldi for his bravery and gave all the pirate leaders bounty to Garibaldi. From then on, the life of Garibaldi's family improved, and he finally had the opportunity to study. Well read, coupled with what he saw and heard at sea, convinced him that only Mazzini could save Italy, so he resolutely joined the Carbonari party. More than 10 years have passed, and the Fourth Roman Republic has placed the hopes of countless people, but it was dashed by its creators. The difference is that this time Mazzini did not leave. He sent away his mistress Mrs. Sang, and then took his adopted daughter Italy to start planning a new uprising. Because Mazzini felt that the Great Revolution across Europe was coming, and the Italians must set an example for Europeans. However, Garibaldi had a different view at this time. The government of the Austrian Empire was much cleaner and more efficient than the government of the Fourth Roman Republic. In the Austrian camp, there were Lombards, Venetians, Goni, a derogatory name for the people living near Romagna, Neapolitans, Sicilians, Germans, Croatians, and Bohemians. Everyone works together, trains together, eats together, sleeps together, eats the same food, wears the same clothes, and wants to live a good life together. If it were just a sugar-coated bullet, Garibaldi had repeatedly rejected high-ranking officials and generous salaries offered by the enemy. The Austrian Empire's generosity to its troops and citizens lay in its sea lanes and its food reserves that had been established in advance. After many inquiries, Garibaldi finally found the location of the Austrian Empire's grain depot. The food here was enough for the entire Lombardy people to survive this year. He felt that if he could burn this place, the Austrians would no longer be able to use food to win people's hearts. Although many innocent people will die, the flame of hope for the Italian nation will be rekindled. However, Garibaldi was destined to be a hero, not a hero. He could not let thousands or even millions of people be buried with him for the sake of his own righteousness. In the end, Garibaldi left the grain depot in despair, and soon his German commander told him an even more shocking secret. The Austrian Empire built hundreds of grain depots like this over the years, in order to one day be able to cope with possible disasters. Neither the army nor the government quite understood what the royal family was doing. The church called it the fear of God, and even called those secret granaries arks. After learning all this, Garibaldi seemed a little confused, but his wife Anita was very happy. After all, she no longer had to fight. The latter had already planned to wait until the storm passed, and then return to the tribe in South America with Garibaldi to live with their 4 children. However, it seems that the god of destiny does not intend to let them go just like this. The United Kingdom, France, and the Ottoman Empire issued an ultimatum to the Austrian Empire. If the Habsburg family does not give up the title of Emperor of the German Empire, then the 3 countries will work together to implement justice. This news was undoubtedly a shot in the arm for Italian nationalists, but Garibaldi only heard angry denunciations and fear of war in the military camp. "There's going to be a war again," an old man said sadly. "What are you afraid of? The Empire's army is invincible. Last time I had no choice. This time I must make a difference." A middle-aged man said angrily, his eyes full of ecstasy. He was on the wrong team before. After the Italian coalition was defeated, he was abandoned. At this time, the old man spoke again, with a sad tone. "As an old man, I have nothing to be afraid of. I'm thinking of my son and my grandson. They are both dead. I don't know how many of you young people will die in this war. I heard that only tyrants like war. I don't think this Austrian Empire can last long." Fart. How can anyone not die in a war? Don't listen to his nonsense. With his looks, no army would want him. He eats here all day and waits for death to destroy our morale. If there are no military regulations, I really want to kill this old bastard. You old bastard who picks up the bowl to eat and curses your mother when you put it down. People bully you right to your doorstep. Why don't you fight back and wait for someone to shit on your head? I heard that the French came to liberate us. They talk about human rights and democracy publicly. Known science time in the 19th century. Really? It's great. You don't have to pay taxes and you get land. A young boy with missing teeth smiled stupidly. The old man touched the child's head kindly and said in a positive tone, "No. France is the beacon of the world. Those nobles and kings are most afraid of France's righteous teachers. When the French come, hang all these noble gentlemen, and then give us all their land. Really? Will Sergeant Baron be hanged too? The articulate little boy continued to ask, and the old man laughed happily. Of course. The nobles' lackeys should also be killed. Great. I want to join the French army too. The little boy clapped his hands happily, and the old man became more and more enthusiastic as he talked. Good boy. When you join the French army and you have white bread to eat every day, you won't have to eat bread like we do all day long. The little boy instantly felt that the macaroni in his bowl was no longer fragrant. He gritted his teeth and was about to pour the macaroni in the bowl to the ground when a big man on the side snatched it away. If you don't eat it, don't waste it. I'll eat it. You. The little boy was obviously a little annoyed, but he didn't dare to say anything because of the other person's size. Don't worry, there are no such people in the French army. Have you ever seen French people be so nice? Of course, the old man answered very proudly, but the surroundings suddenly became quiet and no one responded. He looked back and met the eyes of Baron Marcello. Chapter 982. The old man immediately burst into laughter. Good afternoon, Mr. Marcello. Baron. Marcello's eyes were kind, and he didn't seem angry. The old man made up his mind. It seemed that the other party didn't know what he said. Old sir, what's your name? Me. I'm Kaa from Pasji village. You can just call me Kaa. Ko took off his hat and replied with fear. After all, Marcello was a noble and an imperial official, and the former was just an old tramp. The deep-seated fear of nobles and officials could not be acted out. Ah. You satisfied with the food in our military camp? Are you still used to the life in the military camp, Baron? Marcello continued to ask in a pleasant tone. Kaa looked at the crowd of people around and gathered more and more, and then he boldly said, Mr. Marcello, what we have been eating all day is either beans or flour. How can we have the strength to fight? And we are asked to either build bridges or mend roads all day long. We are simply used as coolies. How do we look like an army? In fact, what Kaa said was also a question in the minds of many people. They obviously joined the Austrian Imperial Army, but they either trained or did some physical work of repairing bridges and roads every day. This was far from the army they imagined, and some even suspected that some unscrupulous businessmen were using them as coolies under the banner of the imperial government. However, everyone quickly eliminated this option because it was impossible for a family in the Milan area, or even in the entire northern Italy, to mobilize so many officials and troops, let alone build dozens of barracks that could accommodate tens of thousands of people. Franz asked these people to do the work of post-war reconstruction, mainly to improve the efficiency of reconstruction. After all, the organization of the army is much higher than that of ordinary commercial organizations. Secondly, Franz also needs to collect an interest to balance the expenses, which are both financial and moral. Because there is no price, it is not profound enough. Because there is no price, it is not worth cherishing. Because there is no price, you can be confident. Franz is not qualified to comment on human nature, but he is very clear about the instincts of living things, such as selfishness, greed, and laziness, so he never minds using the greatest malice to speculate on people's hearts in order not to chill the few people who truly possess noble qualities. He must avoid the opportunity for others to take advantage of him at the root. Back to the topic. The conversation between Marcello and Ko continues. Don't beans and macaroni suit your taste? What kind of meal do you think is suitable? Kaa looked at the crowd of spectators and continued to speak boldly. Mr. Marcello, I heard that the French army only eats white bread. That's good. I also heard that the gentlemen in Vienna use white bread as a rag to wipe their mouths and throw it away. After wiping it. Instead of throwing it away, why not give it to us to eat? Ko's words immediately exploded in the crowd. The soldiers were half envious and half resentful. What I envy is that the French army can eat delicious white bread, and what I hate is naturally the luxurious life of the noble lords. I would rather throw it away than give it to poor people like them. Baron Marcello didn't pay attention to the noisy crowd, nor did he care about the regular troops brought by Sergeant Cullen. He just continued to ask, Mr. KAA, have you seen it with your own eyes, Baron? Marcello didn't seem to care too much, which made KO think that the other party might also be an anti-Austrian or a neutral third party. Of course, I saw Napoleon back then. He was riding on a 3-meter high horse, carrying such a big bag, and then handed bread to every French soldier. Baron. Marcello finally sneered. You said that Napoleon and the French were the enemies of nobles and kings, but did you know that Napoleon proclaimed himself emperor when he returned? This old KO was obviously not prepared for Baron Marcello's sudden question, and everyone in Europe knew that Napoleon proclaimed himself emperor, so he could not think of a reason to refute it for the moment. Pasta is more expensive than white bread in Italy because it's also made from wheat flour and requires more complicated processing. No Italian knows this. Where did you come from? A fine line of cold sweat immediately broke out on old KAA's forehead, but fear and nervousness made him tongue-tied and unable to speak a word. And how did Napoleon, who was 1.6 meters tall, ride a tall draft horse? Don't you know that draft horses are used to plow fields and pull carts? Old KAA's words were full of loopholes. Baron Marcello asked more than a dozen questions in a row, but he couldn't answer any of them. Seeing that the old KAA was hesitating and unable to say a word, Baron Marcello continued, "Let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, there was a family who lived in their own manor without worrying about the world. But one day the French came. They broke into the manor without any explanation. They first killed the man of the house, then forcibly hugged the mistress in front of the children. After robbing the manor's property, they drove the mistress and the children out own home. The French did then distribute the land to tenants, but those who received the land were also sent to war by the French, and the taxes levied by the French were more than 3 times as high as in the past. In the end, the French failed, but they still did not forget to burn the manor and fields with fire before leaving. This is the tragedy of Marcello Manor. And I'm the only survivor." Everyone around them had expressions of disbelief, but Baron Marcello was not here to tell stories today. He wanted to solve the hidden dangers in the military camp. At this time, Sergeant Cullen also arrived with the regular army. Garibaldi and his wife just watched silently, without action or words. The interrogation process was not complicated. Old KAA was hung on a makeshift cross, and with just a few whips, the old tramp was ready. He was not a pro-French person at all. Someone gave him 10 florins to spread French democracy and freedom in the military camp, and how good the life of French soldiers was, and how invincible the French army was. The old tramp committed treason. In order to survive, he told everything he knew, and identified the mastermind who instigated him. The mastermind is a very prestigious local family, and is even responsible for the transportation of food for the army. The mastermind was not a French spy who broke into Austria, but a simple spiritual Frenchman. If it were in the past, then the mastermind would most likely have been tried and thrown into prison. His family can still dominate the local area and even retain business with the army. Then when the limelight passes, the mastermind will be released again, perhaps even granted a pardon by the emperor to show royal mercy. However, Franz had long hated the rebels in the Austrian Empire, who could never be killed, so he dealt with them according to wartime methods. The mastermind will be directly executed. His and his family's property will be frozen. The industry will be temporarily taken over by the government, and his family members must also be supervised. As for the old tramp, although he was exempted from the death penalty, he must also pay the price for his actions to spend the rest of his life in the Empire's mines. Chapter 983. Welcome. Garibaldi had no interest in the war between France and Austria. He would rather continue building bridges and repairing roads than fighting a war. But as Sergeant Giuseppe he had to join Benedict's expeditionary force because of the strong recommendation of his superiors and colleagues. Both Baron Marcello and Sergeant Karen believe that Sergeant Giuseppe and his team are the best in the entire recruit camp. Even though Sergeant Giuseppe seems to have no interest in military training, their team's results are outstanding. This has to be said about Garibaldi's personal charm and leadership qualities. Those outstanding people in the recruit camp will always come to his side. Unconsciously point on the Italian battlefield. Austria and France invested more than 500,000 troops, but the entire battlefield was extremely quiet. Malta Island. An overly large fleet had to be anchored in 2 ports, and the inhabitants of the entire island were not even as numerous as the expeditionary force. Fortunately, Britain's huge business empire can promptly allocate supplies from all over the world to solve the logistics problems of this fleet. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. smoked a pipe and wore an admiral's coat, looking like a tough guy. This could not help but boost the morale of the British naval soldiers. However, at this time, Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. was in trouble. He was facing the same problem as Codrington at this time. Edward Codrington, the hero of the Battle of Navarino, defeated the invincible Ottoman fleet, the savior of the Greeks, but was a sinner of Britain. Russia released the culprit in the Black Sea. As commander of the British fleet, Edward Codrington defeated the combined Egyptian and Ottoman fleets at the Battle of Navarino, but his order was to maintain the balance of power in the Mediterranean. Although Edward Codrington has been defending his actions, he has never been forgiven by the British government, and finally had to die in pain for the rest of his life. Now Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. is also facing this problem. The British government obviously does not want the French to dominate the Mediterranean. Originally, this problem was not unsolvable, although it was a combined fleet. As long as old Edward Hobart Seymour did not contribute in the war and allowed the French and Austrians to fight, Britain would naturally be the final winner. However, the British government issued an order to recover Crete and force the Greek government to negotiate peace. These 2 orders put Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. in a dilemma, so he thought of a way, which was to leave the French fleet and act alone. After all, the last time the Austrians captured Crete with the army, it was normal for them to send troops to search the island carefully after occupying Crete. If the Austrians are not stupid, they will definitely use this opportunity to fight the French navy. Of course, even if the Austrians are all fools, someone will help them come up with the idea of a decisive battle. After all, there are friends of the British Empire all over the world, and Vienna is no exception. When France and Austria decide the winner, he only needs to finish the game. After all, 38 battleships. This number was almost equal to the combined battleships of France and Austria. To be honest, he really didn't know how he could lose. As for the rumored Austrian Imperial army, he was even more dismissive, because at this time there were also a large number of marines in his army, and the total strength of 40,000 people could almost make him invincible. In addition, the maneuverability of this huge fleet is also the best in the world. At this time, the French Grand Orient fleet can't even see their shadow is the best proof. Of course, even with such a powerful force, the subsequent battle to seize the island will not be easy. Fortunately, the Greeks on the island are thinking of Britain and will cooperate with Seymour's fleet on the island to seize control of the port. Seymour decided to rest for a day on the island of Malta before attacking Crete. At the same time, he was also trying to lure the snake out of its hole. Although his troops were strong enough at this time, no one could guarantee that the Austrians would not repeat their same tactics as for the rumored aircraft of the Austrian Empire. Seymour did not believe it. After all, the British Empire, which once produced Sir Isaac Newton, was the world's #1 in technology. Nothing happened overnight, which made Seymour even more convinced that the so-called army seizure of the island was a shameless lie and just the sophistry of an incompetent person. The British new Mediterranean fleet set sail again, without encountering the main fleet of the Austrian Empire along the way. Arriving at Crete, there were only some light civilian ships in the port. Through the telescope, old Edward Hobart Seymour even saw the flag of the British Empire rising, and he showed a very contemptuous smile. It was a wise choice for the Austrians to flee. The naval officers around him also laughed. What? A bunch of cowardly cowards. Haha, it's no honor for them to make us win like this. The Austrians made a very wise choice. Don't underestimate our opponents. The glory of the British Empire's navy can no longer withstand the slightest tarnishment. Old Edward Hobart Seymour said very seriously, and the generals on the side immediately shut up. Gentlemen, prepare to dock. You must search the entire island carefully and then deploy defenses as you command, sir. In addition, notify each ship to put the gunners in position. The Messenger immediately boarded the watchtower and waved the flag, which made the atmosphere in the entire fleet tense. This may indeed be a trap for the Austrians, but the few turrets near the port alone are obviously unlikely to pose a threat to such a large fleet. Moreover, the initiative on the battlefield is in the hands of the British. They can completely leave the battlefield and then choose the time and place to launch operations on the island. In short, they are in an invincible position. The huge fleet slowly sailed into the harbor. The lookouts paid close attention to the movements of the forts on both sides. There was no one nearby at all. The crowd seemed to be gathering in front of the pier of the port to welcome the arrival of the British Army. Fleet Commander Seymour let out a sigh of relief, but the next second there was a huge explosion ahead. Water columns rose into the sky, and then a cruiser in front of him that was responsible for opening the way slowly sank, as if it hit a rock. What the hell is going on? Hurry! Before Seymour finished speaking, there was another loud noise, and another light frigate began to sink slowly. Only then did he notice that there were many wooden barrels floating in the sea. Because he had been too focused on the two sides and the dock, he had ignored these inconspicuous wooden barrels. It was quite normal for barrels and floating objects to appear near docks in this era, because many sailors at that time regarded the ocean as a garbage dump, and it was not uncommon to throw empty barrels into the sea. Damn it, it's a mine. Get out quickly, Seymour roared angrily, and the messengers quickly climbed up to the watchtower and waved flags, but it was too late. The barrels in the sea exploded one after another, and some boats were directly blown into pieces. At the same time, the forts on both sides also opened fire. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 984 Mine. Although the British New Mediterranean Fleet encountered an ambush at this time, its combat power was still crushingly powerful. A few blown up small ships actually had little impact on the combat effectiveness of this huge fleet. But in the panic, Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. issued what he thought was the safest and most prudent order. If it were just those few forts, there would be no need to retreat, but the mines brought too much uncertainty. Although mines were not common in naval operations at this time, they could achieve amazing results every time. Whether it was the American War of Independence, the Greek War of Independence, or the Russo-Turkish War, mines played an important role. At this time, the main types of mines were floating mines. As the name suggests, the so-called floating mines mainly rely on waves. These mines will explode when they collide with ships, bridges, rocks and the like. The combat effectiveness of this kind of mine is usually very short, only a few days or even a few hours, but it is powerful enough. A single mine can destroy a light frigate of hundreds of tons, and even large battleships cannot withstand multiple explosions of mines. However, its shortcomings are also extremely obvious. Because there is no modern automatic locking device, floating mines and destroying ships mainly rely on luck and quantity. Of course, if it is in the open sea, thousands of floating mines may not be able to blow up enemy ships. It is easy for an experienced captain to avoid these floating mines without automatic navigation and temporary driving devices. However, at this time, the small bay was filled with a huge number of ships, and it was difficult for those floating mines to blow up anything. What's even more frightening is the uncertainty it brings. Those warships that were sunk by stray mines were like rocks in such a narrow bay. They may cause more warships to run aground at any time, causing a series of more chaotic chain reactions. The Austrian artillerymen, who had been hiding near the fort for a long time, rushed to the fort almost immediately and fired their loaded artillery pieces. The latest ship killer, high explosive bomb, flew out of the gun barrel and landed on the British warship. With huge explosions, sawdust flew everywhere, and large pieces of deck debris even nailed people to the wall. However, the British Navy was not blocked. Their gun doors had already been opened, and the gunners also aimed at the fort. The close-range shooting of more than a dozen battleships destroyed the forts on both sides in an instant, but the chaos of the British Army did not stop. Seymour's fleet was too large, especially the huge sailing battleships, and it was not easy to turn around. It was relatively easy for those paddle wheel battleships to turn around. but because they were not in sync with other battleships, it made the whole scene even more chaotic. What's even more frightening is that the fleet at the rear is not aware of the situation, and some small boats keep turning around and frantically escaping for their lives. As a result, accidents occur frequently at the mouth of the bay, and the entire bay looks like a large car accident scene. The Austrian army on the other side of the pier was frantically dropping drift mines into the sea, and barrels filled with gunpowder were compressing the space of the British fleet. But the British Navy is not easy to mess with. Every salvo fired by the dozen or so battleships in the bay can destroy large areas of buildings. The warehouse near the dock, where the mines were stored, and the carriage carrying the mines were successively covered by artillery fire, followed by a series of huge explosions. The pier was filled with smoke and the fire spread quickly. The Austrian troops on the shore were also in chaos. Their continuous shelling and fire interrupted their command point. Some people want to put out fires, some are rescuing supplies, some are dropping floating mines into the sea, some are looking for hidden artillery to prepare for counterattack, and some are scared out of their wits and running around on the dock screaming. But British Fleet Commander Seymour still frowned. He thought that with his powerful troops and firepower, any conspiracy would be nothing more than a ridiculous struggle. Those forts did not pose a threat to his powerful fleet at all. Even if there were hidden firepower points, the fleet would only need to pay a very small price to win. However, he was defeated by those small wooden barrels, and could only let the easy victory slip away from him. Compared with the approaching wooden barrels, the chaos at the mouth of the bay was more deadly at this time. Several small warships had been hit and sunk. These sunken small warships made the already narrow mouth of the bay even narrower. At this time, Commander Seymour regretted letting the main fleet enter the fjord. If we just send some light ships to take the lead, it will be easy to retreat at this time. But it is impossible for light ships to beat the forts on both sides to pieces and turn the dock into a sea of flames. But no matter whether he used light ships to take the lead or the main force, he could not capture the port. Ultimately, Seymour did not expect the Austrians to use mines, and in such large numbers. The demeaning methods of this era were still very hardcore. From the east to the west, whether facing underwater Dragon King cannons or beer barrels, the only way to clear them was to directly hit them with ships. However, the Austrian side seemed not to want to give Seymour any chance. There were at least 1,000 floating mines on the sea at this time. Although the price of gunpowder has dropped again and again through industrialized production after the Industrial Revolution, using thousands of floating mines at one time still seems very arrogant. There are usually 50 to 100 kilograms of black powder in a drift mine. At this time, the price of a barrel of black powder is about £40. A barrel of black powder is about 286.2 kilograms, and the price of 100 kilograms of black powder is about £13.97. At this time, the price of an old-fashioned flintlock gun was only £1 to £2, and the price of a new front-loading smoothbore gun was only £8 to £10. The price of a rifled gun was about 1.5-2 times the price of a smoothbore gun. In other words, as soon as they met, the Austrian side destroyed the equipment of thousands of people. Of course, the results were also very impressive. The British Army lost ships worth at least tens of thousands of troops at this time. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. figured that if the Austrians tried this trick at every port, he would be in big trouble. But if you think about it carefully, it's impossible, because this time you were careless. If you had not entered the bay rashly, but had chosen to fight steadily, no matter how many floating mines the Austrians dropped into the sea, you would not have any consequences, as long as you left ? When the floating mines drift away with the ocean currents, the Austrians on the island will be lambs to be slaughtered. Just as he was calculating how many more ships he would need to lose to pass through the bay, the warship traveling in the center of the channel suddenly exploded. There was no time to think about it, and explosions came one after another. At least 3 small and medium-sized warships were seriously injured and were about to sink. One battleship was also seriously injured, but it barely made it out of the bay. How is this going, Edward? Hobart Seymour Sr. roared angrily, because he had not found the stray mine at sea, but it was impossible for his ship to explode for no reason. The British sailors who fell into the water soon gave the answer. A British captain who fell into the water shouted, "Underwater." These floating mines come from the water only. Then did Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. notice that there were several strange boats at the mouth of the bay, and there were also some people dressed as fishermen on the shore, who were hacking at cables with knives and axes. Damn it. Kill them. As soon as the British warship approached, the people dressed as fishermen immediately ran away. The loss statistics have been released. Counting the 3 frigates that were just sunk, the British Army has lost 12 light gunboats, 5 transport ships, 4 frigates, and 2 cruisers in this battle. In addition, a 3rd level battleship was seriously injured. Chapter 985. The Flying Dragon is in the sky. In fact, Austria's losses were not small. All 4 forts were destroyed, and more than a dozen artillery squads hidden on both sides of the strait were almost completely wiped out. The port was a sea of fire, and all military and civilian facilities on the dock were destroyed. The losses of the British Army were simply a drop in the bucket for this fleet of more than 200 ships, but Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. was furious, because he had never suffered such a heavy loss in his life. Let the soldiers on the gunboat transfer to the transport ship, and then use the gunboat to open the way. We must take Crete today. Although the total amount of floating mines used by the Austrians is large, it is still possible to clear a channel in a small area if the ships are concentrated. Moreover, even if the light gunboat hits a mine and sinks, it will not turn into a reef like those large ships and block the progress of the ships behind it. So the British fleet, which was about to escape the trap, fought back again. Old Edward Hobart Seymour's tactics were indeed very effective. When the gunboat hit the dense group of drifting mines, an explosion triggered a chain reaction, causing the entire minefield failed together. The Austrian soldiers on the dock were frantically throwing floating mines into the water, but the British warships were not for nothing. After destroying the turrets and firepower points on both sides, the British ships could confidently and boldly launch an attack formation, firing a round of broadside fire, and countless black spheres flying towards the dock as gunpowder smoke spewed out from the missiles. High explosive bombs are not a secret. The Austrian army has them, and the British also have them. The dense rain of bullets fell on the pier, setting off a dense explosion. Some carriages transporting mines were blown up into the sky with people and vehicles. The mines that were directly hit also exploded. Even some mines that had just been launched into the water were pushed to the dock by the wave caused by the explosion of the shells. The triggering device in the mine does not matter whether you are British or Austrian, let alone a ship or a trestle. As long as the impact is strong enough, it will explode. Victory. Victory. Our British Empire is indeed invincible. The soldiers on the British ships suddenly cheered as they all saw the remaining Austrian soldiers fleeing. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. also breathed a sigh of relief. He exchanged a minimal loss for a big victory. This is much better than stopping the loss in time or running away hastily. After all, the story of turning defeat into victory is always the most exciting point. However, before he had time to be happy, the lookout hand on the mast fell from the top with a strange scream. Is this how extreme joy leads to sorrow? The lookout who fell on the deck did not die immediately. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. wanted to show his gentlemanly demeanor, so he stepped forward and asked, "I am Admiral Edward Hobart Seymour. Son, do you have anything you want me to bring to your family?" The lookout hand fell so hard that he was speechless. He reluctantly raised his finger and pointed at the sky. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. looked up and was stunned on the spot. It was a sight he had never seen or imagined. Huge floating objects in the sky were over the fleet, and a huge shadow shrouded everyone's mind. What is that? Old Edward Hobart Seymour asked subconsciously. Although he knew hot air balloons, these huge floating objects in front of him were obviously beyond his knowledge. This is true for a highly educated and well-informed fleet commander, let alone ordinary soldiers who can't even recognize the English alphabet. It's a dragon. I don't know who shouted the first call, but there were endless responses immediately. It's a dragon. 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 Run. The dragon is about to breathe fire. In traditional Western stories, dragons usually play the role of villain boss, such as Dungeons and Dragons and Dragon Quest Point. Although Dragon Quest is a Japanese game, it is also a derivative of Western culture in Japan, and the Western fantasy flavor is relatively pure. Point after the concept of dragons in the sky spread throughout the fleet, the British Army fell into unprecedented chaos. After all, the legend about dragons is deeply rooted in the hearts of the people, and when human beings face the unknown, they always like to look for substitutes from the things they already know. Damn it. That's not a dragon. Shoot it down. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. was the first to react. He immediately issued an order hoping to stabilize the morale of the troops. After all, no matter what it was impossible to withstand the power of the cannon point, but he said it was too late. At this time, the British soldiers had already become a group of frightened birds, and some even chose to jump into the sea to escape. Point the rapid spread of panic turned the normally well-trained British troops into a swarm of flies. As for using cannons to shoot down airships, I'm sorry, I really can't do that. At this time, the elevation angle of the artillery generally does not exceed 70 degrees. While the maximum elevation angle of naval artillery is usually only 45 degrees, and the artillery shells used are not suitable for attacking high altitude targets, so the surrounding officers and soldiers only fell into a brief sinking, and then responded to Edward Hobart Seymour Sr.'s orders with greater chaos. The artilleryman fired randomly, as if this could scare away the dragons in the sky. Point the gunner on the lower deck couldn't even see the sky. He only heard a dragon attacking their fleet. The fleet commander ordered to fire. The artillery below had already started shooting in the distance, causing waves on the water. Based on the above factors, the gunners on the lower deck felt that the dragon must be attacking them from the sea. Point this random shooting and accidental injuries are inevitable. Point then someone shouted again, "Dragon! Flame! It's a fire dragon! Run!" The number of people jumping to escape increased, which made Friedrich, who was watching the battle from a distance, confused. Why don't the British just run away, but continue to attack? Why are they bombarding where they are? In fact, the Austrian Navy has more experience in operating airships than the Austrian Army. However, due to performance issues with early airships, these guys were of virtually no use in actual combat. Point the climate on the sea is much harsher than on land, and there are fewer places suitable for landing, resulting in a very high accident rate for naval airships. At the same time, their practicality in naval battles is also very poor. Although the detection range is larger, their performance is unstable, and if the intelligence cannot be sent back, no matter how large the range is, it is useless. As for the so-called offensive nature, using a rifle on an airship to aim at an object hundreds of meters or even 1,000 meters away is no less difficult than finding a needle in a haystack. Point if the Austrian Weapons Development Agency had not developed the grenade, its attack power would only exist in theory. Point but even so, bomb delivery is also affected by wind force, wind speed, wind direction, the shape of the bomb itself, and even gravity. Point but fortunately, here, in this huge bathtub, there are countless British ships. Chapter 986 Sea Legend. Of course, in addition to simple throwing weapons like grenades, Franz also prepared special surprises for the British. Point church inventors like to call it the wrath of God, but Friedrich felt it was more appropriate to call it the devil's gift. At this time, there was a box hanging under each Austrian airship. The airship soldiers confirmed that they had reached the sky above the British and began to cut the special cable. Point as the cables were cut, the wooden boards on one side of the box fell off and the contents fell out. Point in addition to shock absorbing and anti-collision materials such as cotton and sponge, there are also some broken glass and white powder. White powder and cotton wool floated in the wind, and the British soldiers below were a little confused. Point but the powder and cotton that poured down suddenly burned violently, turning into pillars of fire that towered over the British ships like real dragon's breath. Point several British soldiers were struck by the dragon's breath, and Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. ordered help. As the elite of the British Royal Navy, the soldiers on the ship are naturally familiar with basic tasks such as fire extinguishing. Point a few buckets of cold water were poured over to extinguish the fire, but the soldiers who were burned were screaming and looking very painful. Point not only did this fail to attract sympathy from other people, but it was despised by the people around it. After all, how much harm can it do if it is burned for just a while? Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. couldn't help but lecture his soldiers. You should be lucky that the Austrians didn't throw oil. Otherwise before old Edward Hobart Seymour finished speaking, the soldiers' bodies were on fire again. The extinguished flames on the deck also burned again, and the same thing happened to the surrounding ships. Moreover, these flames burned so fiercely that the flesh and blood of the ignited soldiers melted at a speed visible to the naked eye, and the oak floor, which was famous for its fire resistance, was actually ignited. However, before he could take command, a new gift arrived. Wooden-handled grenades and spherical bombs continued to fall, but the hit rate was extremely low. Even against a target as large as a battleship, most of the bombs fell into the sea point, but even if only a few landed on British ships, it would be enough to be the last straw that broke their spirits. The dragon is coming. Why can't the fire be put out? Help, run away. At this time, the British army was finally completely swallowed up by chaos and fear. The British sailors either jumped into the water or frantically grabbed the rudder in an attempt to quickly escape from this dragon's nest. In the poisonous smoke, emitted by the burning white phosphorus, no one could make out the flagship's semaphore. The British Royal Navy has once again returned to their true nature. The pirates don't care so much. They just want to survive. As a result, shipwrecks occurred one after another. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. was first frightened by the resurgence of the dragon's breath, and was frightened physically and mentally. Then he inhaled a large amount of poisonous smoke, and was now unconscious. The deputy commander of the fleet who was supposed to take over the command had been doused with white phosphorus before, and his bones were burned to ashes. Therefore, the flagship captain could only serve as temporary commander. This temporary commander had no way to deal with the dragon above his head, so he issued the retreat order without hesitation. This order made the already chaotic scene even more chaotic, and eventually a scene of 100 rivalries quarreling emerged. There were only 2 British warships that were actually destroyed in the air raid. Both of them were transport ships. One of them was because there were too few people to put out the fire, and the other was because there were too many people. Too many people acted randomly, and the ship capsized. However, during the retreat, at least 20 ships capsized due to collisions and squeezing. Fortunately, those dragons did not continue to pursue. Otherwise the fleet's losses would be even greater in this battle. The British New Mediterranean Fleet lost 1/5 of its total ships and 1/8 of its troops, but the loss in spirit and morale was greater than the actual loss, especially those who witnessed their companions being cremated alive in front of them. They all felt that this was a power that only ghosts and gods could possess, and it was completely in line with the characteristics of dragons, a mythical creature. This British army is not weak. They are well equipped, well trained, and experienced in hundreds of battles. However, they have never encountered enemies from the sky, and no one expected such a battle to happen. No one remembers the mines that destroyed more ships. They only know that the flames fell from the sky, the explosions, the thick smoke, the flames that kept reigniting, the screams, and the wails. If the Austrians could call these monsters in the sky to help in every naval battle, then they would have no chance of victory at all. Thinking back to the previous disappearance of the Mediterranean fleet and the legend of sea monsters, the British sailors couldn't help but feel even more shaken. Not only the sailors, but also some naval officers became suspicious. Have you heard? The Austrians not only have dragons, but also sea monsters. Dragon? Sea monster? What are you talking about? Didn't the captain just say that it was a hot air balloon? Hot air balloon? Have you ever seen a hot air balloon that breathes fire? The latter was speechless for a moment, and the former continued. Listen to their nonsense. The captain was the fastest runner just now. He hid in the captain's room and locked the door and didn't care about our lives. The latter finally wavered and asked doubtfully, where did the news about the sea monster come from? Is it reliable? Of course. My cousin works in Whitehall. He also accidentally overheard the conversation between the Prime Minister and the Lord of the Admiralty. Because the incident was too sensational, it had to be concealed from the public. Whitehall, the name for the British executive branch. It began in the 17th century and is not a parody of the American White House. Don't be so pretentious. Tell me what's going on. Do you know the former Mediterranean fleet? Isn't he missing? How is that possible? Dozens of battleships and tens of thousands of soldiers were just gone. Could it really be a sea monster? What kind of monster is so powerful? It is said to have an octopus-like body with countless huge tentacles that can easily roll up a battleship and tear it into two pieces. Aren't you talking about the Kraken? Doesn't it live in the North Sea? Krakens. Legendary Kraken is world famous for its huge size and terrifying appearance. The oceans are all connected. You don't even know this? Then it can't single out us British people. Who said that? I specifically asked someone to check it in the Navy archives. What do you think? How about it? In 1782, a fleet led by Vice Admiral Termond mysteriously disappeared in a certain sea area of North America. 10 battleships and more than 5,000 officers and soldiers were not spared. The legend of a siren that likes to travel around the world and eat British people has spread like wildfire. Chapter 987 A Great Shame and Humiliation. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. was in no mood to pay attention to the rumors among the army, and continuing the attack on Crete was out of the question. Theoretically, he must convey what happened here back home as quickly as possible, because the threat from the sky is beyond his ability to deal with. However, the reality is that Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. did not issue a similar order. He just ordered the fleet to sail to the island of Malta at full speed. At this time, old Edward Hobart Seymour no longer dared to look down upon Austria as an opponent, and the delay in the main fleet of the Austrian Imperial Navy aggravating his premonition. What is the main force of the Austrian Imperial Navy doing? I'm afraid that it is very possible to choose to bypass him and attack Malta Island. Once the new Mediterranean fleet loses the island of Malta, it can only seek refuge in Cyprus or even Ottoman Istanbul. In this way, the British Mediterranean fleet will no longer be a sharp sword for Britain to penetrate into the Mediterranean, but a prisoner in a cage, which cannot be used. No matter how powerful it is, it has to be said that the British admirals had a strong view of the overall situation at this time. Just one meeting had already guessed the intentions of the Austrian Navy, but only 70-80%. At this time, the British naval ships were in an awkward period of alternation between old and new, sail power, steam power, sail steam hybrid power, multi-masted galleon, and top-masted schooner. Different power, different styles, and products of different years result in a considerable speed gap. If it were normal times, then Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. could have taken his time and kept pace. But what he needs now is time. Since the fall of Crete, Britain has been strengthening the defense of Malta. The island of Malta has been an important military location since ancient times, and the Knights Hospital has built a large number of medieval defense facilities on it. However, the total number of soldiers and civilians on Malta Island is less than 20,000, and most of the so-called defense facilities were built hundreds of years ago. It is still unclear whether they can block the modern army. Therefore, Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. had to be fast at this time, and he decided to organize the new large battleships and paddle wheel battleships, as well as some new clippers, into the front group. The remaining baggage ships, troop carriers and old warships formed the rear group. His reason for doing this is that the front team is mainly responsible for fighting, and if it encounters the main force of the Austrian Imperial Navy, it can directly engage in battle. Even with only 1/3 of the force, Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. was confident that he could defeat the so-called Austrian Navy. Even if you can't completely wipe out your opponents, you can at least escape the battlefield with your excellent mobility. As for the rear team, although they are all old antiques, the old dogs still have a few teeth. What's more, these British antiques are still terrible war beasts in the eyes of the world's powers, and they are the confidence of the British Empire to sweep the world. And theoretically speaking, the rear team does not need to participate in direct combat, but only serves as a reserve team and insurance just in case. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr., whose own flagship was in the front line, wanted to avenge his disgrace. However, As far as the port of Malta, the British did not encounter the enemy they expected. Seeing the British Empire flag on the Malta port and the peaceful and busy docks, the officers and soldiers of the British Navy couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. To be honest, they really didn't know how to face the Austrians. They were really afraid of seeing the sky full of dragons or elliptical hot air balloons and the harbor spitting tongues of fire mercilessly at the ground, and then covering the sky above them again. Fortunately, that tragedy did not happen, but Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. had no relaxed expression on his face at all. On the contrary, he frowned even more tightly. Where are the Austrians? Could it be that my speed was too fast and I missed it on the vast sea? Or do they have a bigger conspiracy? What do they want to do? Shouldn't we do something before we join the French Grand Eastern Fleet? What are the Austrians doing? Are they having a celebration party thinking the war is over? Countless questions filled his mind, and what should he do? Among countless options, Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. chose the safest one: to reinforce the defenses and wait for backup. There are supplies and shore guns on Malta Island. Here he can at least be invincible. As for the issue of aircraft, he selectively ignored it because this weapon looked scary, but the damage it caused to the fleet was much less than imagined. The second and most important reason is that he can't think of a way to solve it yet. However, early the next morning, old Edward Hobart Seymour received bad news. The rear team transporting soldiers and supplies was attacked. More than half of the escort fleet was lost, but only 3 of the 20 old battleships were lost. The most serious losses were those ships responsible for transporting baggage and soldiers, with losses of nearly 2/3. This was actually revenge against the British, because Edward Hobart Seymour Sr.'s fleet destroyed all the Austrian Empire's trading posts and strongholds in the Mediterranean. After entering the Mediterranean, all merchant ships, goods, and personnel of the Austrian Empire were also seized. It is more appropriate to say that it is seizure. In fact, it is more appropriate to say that it is robbery. The British asked Austria to compromise and pay a ransom before releasing the Austrian businessmen. France felt that, since the British were such gentlemen, it would be rude for Austria not to return the favor. However, the Austrian Imperial Navy is not a pirate. British cargo and sailors will be thrown directly into the sea. After all, Austria has no place to store this garbage. After attacking the British fleet, Friedrich did not choose to kill them all, but politely gave Britain the choice of surrender or retreat. The commander of the squadron naturally chose to retreat without thinking, because in the battle just now, he found that the number of the Austrian navy was twice as large as the intelligence indicated. Moreover, both tactics and combat power must be stronger than the squadron he leads. Finally, Friedrich's flagship signaled that the British could salvage their sailors and cargo, and left. However, after being pursued for 4 hours, the entire route was littered with lost cargo and sailors from the British Army. In the end, the British squadron commander, Lieutenant General Manco, decided to abandon the cargo and sailors. After all, he didn't know whether the Austrians really let them go, or whether they would fight back when they were salvaging the sailors and cargo. In the end, tens of thousands of British sailors perished at sea. There happened to be dozens of reporters, photographers, missionaries and social activists on a passing Russian merchant ship who witnessed and recorded this scene. The old Edward Hobart Seymour on the island of Malta had a heart palpitation. He lost half of his ships just after the war started. This was an unprecedented shame for the British Empire's navy. Although only 3 of the 38 battleships were lost, the task of conquering Crete and suppressing Greece may not be completed. Chapter 988 Sesame and Watermelon. Those abandoned materials were valuable, and the ships carrying them were even more valuable. However, Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. knew that the tens of thousands of professional sailors and marines were the most valuable. But what the squadron commander, Lieutenant General Manco, desperately salvaged were trophies snatched from Austrian businessmen, wine sent by the French, and even a box of medals shipped from the United Kingdom. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. was furious, but it was not the right time to pursue such a matter. On the contrary, he needed to appease the emotions of these generals, otherwise, the entire army risks a moral collapse. The new aircraft and bizarre weapons used by the Austrians were too heavy a blow to the morale of the British army. As for what Lieutenant General Manco said about the Austrian Navy's strong ships, powerful guns, and well-trained training, In the eyes of Edward Hobart Seymour Sr., it was just an excuse for the incompetent point rather than shirk responsibility. He has a more important thing to do at this time, which is to formulate the next battle plan. However, he did not have many options. It was not a wise move to continue attacking Crete without knowing the military situation or to go deep into the Adriatic Sea to harass the coast of the Austrian Empire. Thinking of this, old Edward Hobart Seymour couldn't help but feel a little angry. What do the idiots in the military intelligence department do for food? Why is such important information that the Austrian Empire possesses a large number of new weapons not highlighted? In fact, this unfairly accuses the British intelligence agencies, the four major British intelligence agencies: Foreign Intelligence Service, Army Intelligence Service, Naval Intelligence Service, and Cambridge Alumni Association. They had long reported what happened in Italy back to the UK, but no one from the Prime Minister, Cabinet, or ministers believed it. Coupled with the media's random reports, even the people and soldiers thought it was just a bad joke. As for Britain's eyes in the central Mediterranean, it had already been swept away by Austria due to previous wars coupled with the fall of the Orleans dynasty. Even the kingdom of the Two Sicilies gave up its original position and moved closer to the Austrian Empire. As a result, all the original British deployments in the Apennines and Greece failed, which in turn caused the British to become blind in the central Mediterranean. The kingdom of the Two Sicilies originally belonged to the Bourbon branch and had always opposed Austria's expansion in Italy, so it had an eye-catching relationship with the British. However, during the Great Rebellion of 1848, the British chose to watch the fire from afar. They even secretly flirted with the rebels and even wanted to support their own puppets. At this time, the Austrian Empire was the defender of order and truly defeated the rebels. Of course, in addition to respect and gratitude, Ferdinand II and his subjects were more afraid of the powerful power and nearly unlimited financial resources of the Austrian Empire. If Ferdinand II and his kingdom of the Two Sicilies were left to solve the raging famine in the Apennine Peninsula, it would not be possible, even if all the money in the treasury and bankers' pockets was empty. The countries most affected by the interception of Austrian merchant ships by the British were not Austria, but those who were waiting for Austrian assistance. British embassies in these countries have been subject to protests and sieges one after another. Coupled with the influence of nationalism, the intelligence work of British embassy personnel and businessmen has been greatly hindered. The British rhetoric is even more difficult to convince the public. They claim that this is for peace and justice, and that everyone's sacrifices and efforts are worth it. However, the hungry people in Italy do not understand why they are always the ones paying the price and being sacrificed. And for whose peace and justice do they suffer these sufferings? In fact, some pro-British factions came up with a compromise. That is, the British could continue to rob Austrian merchant ships, but the food must be transported to the Apennine countries. This will not only quell domestic dissatisfaction, but also better shape the glorious image of the savior of the British Empire. However, the British governor of Malta, the Earl of Salon, and the new commander of the Mediterranean fleet, Edward Hobart Seymour the Elder, unanimously rejected the proposal. First of all, letting food enter the Apennine Peninsula is obviously inconsistent with the major policy of destroying the Austrian Empire's economy, because no one can guarantee that Austrians will not go to central Italy or even South Italy to buy food. Secondly, there is the issue of rights and responsibilities. The UK is a civilized country and has no right to send food from other countries to third countries, let alone this responsibility. Finally, it is not feasible. The merchant ships of the Austrian Empire carried a very complex quantity and type of cargo, and their destinations were even more varied. During the war, it was simply impossible for Britain to allocate so many people to identify them one by one, let alone send a fleet to supervise them. In fact, the piracy habits of the British were at work, and the goods carried by Austrian merchant ships were valuable. The food alone is tens of thousands of tons. Not to mention other goods in the most valuable merchant ships themselves. As for the lack of manpower to send to various countries, this problem is actually very easy to solve. Just let businessmen from various countries take the initiative to send ships to buy them. After all, the last thing to sell during a famine is food. The profit from looting is much higher than military pay. At this time, you can not only loot, but also get military pay. For British soldiers, there is no better time than this kingdom of the two Sicilies. Sicily. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. could not have imagined that he would be killed. At this time, the main force of the Austrian Imperial Navy was facing him across the sea in Augusta Bay. The successive victories boosted the morale of the Austrian Imperial Navy. Almost everyone felt that the British were vulnerable or no more than the best in the world. However, as the commander, Friedrich was not happy at all. Because in his plan, he used so many new equipment and gathered such a huge fleet that he should at least be able to annihilate or cripple the British and then start the second phase of the plan. But the reality is that even if the British take full damage, it will only be a minor injury. 35 battleships are still a force that cannot be ignored. At the same time, Friedrich was also glad that he did not directly engage in a decisive battle with Seymour on his way back to Malta. If the two sides really meet on a narrow road, even if the Austrian Navy can win, it will be a tragic victory. I'm afraid that all the hard work that I have done over the years will be ruined. At least half of the heavily invested fleet and carefully trained sailors will be lost, and there is no possibility of annihilating all the enemy forces. Even if the British lost the Mediterranean fleet again, the blow to them would still be within an acceptable range. If the Austrian Navy loses more than half, they will become an army in a fish tank again. Fortunately, he followed Franz's advice and only pursued them one after another, instead of choosing a strategic decisive battle. Precisely because it was a tail-to-tail pursuit, the resistance of the British Navy was not fierce. After a symbolic resistance, it began to escape. Chapter 989. The Navy should not engage in land war with the army. However, the old sailing warships could not outrun the steamships of the Austrian Navy. Although the killing efficiency is very low, it is safe. Even the occasional brave British captain who wanted to fight back had to face the entire Austrian Imperial Navy. So they can only be heroes for a few minutes at most, and then they have to abandon the ship and escape or sink with their ship in the depths of the sea. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. thought the Austrian Navy was just lucky, but in fact there were Austrian naval intelligence agents at all the ports along the route. Every move of the British fleet was under the watchful eye of the Austrian Navy, so Edward Hobart Seymour Sr.'s squadron was attacked after only a few hours of detachment. At night, the British were attacked at Valletta, the main port on the island of Malta. At least more than 50 patrolmen were killed. But what was even more fatal was the fire in the port area. Dozens of warehouses caught fire at the same time, and the fire spread to a third of the port. Thousands of people died in the fire, and the loss of materials was uncountable. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. could conclude that this must be the work of the Austrians. Otherwise, there was no need for any organization or individual to do such a thing. However, before he could remember to get angry, new bad news came. The Austrians had landed and were heading towards the center of the island. Yes, it turned into a land war in the end. The Austrian Navy took advantage of last night's chaos to send the Austrian army to the island of Malta. The British garrison on the island of Malta was no match for these professional armies, and the medieval defensive buildings were useless against modern artillery. Compared with the Austrian army, which marched towards the center of the island with great fanfare, the Austrian Marine Corps, which was divided into small groups and was almost everywhere, was more difficult to deal with. The mission assigned to these Marines was to destroy, and they attacked lone British sailors and small sites everywhere. The British Empire could not lose the island of Malta. So Edward Hobart Seymour Sr.'s response was to send his own army to annihilate the enemies who landed on the island. Then a naval patrol was sent to prevent Austria from continuing to send reinforcement to Malta Island. At the same time, it was also completely trapping the Austrians on Malta Island. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr.'s response was quite satisfactory, but he overlooked one problem. The Austrian army was closer to Malta than he thought. At this time, there were 4 Austrian military camps on Sicily. Sicily is only 48.5 nautical miles from Malta, and even an old-fashioned sailing ship only takes 4 hours. After Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. fought a week-long land battle with the Austrians on the island of Malta, not only was the British Marine Corps almost wiped out, but even the sailors suffered heavy losses. However, Austria's army on the island of Malta was increasing. At this time, he finally understood a truth. The Navy shouldn't be fighting a land war with the army. However, the island of Malta was too important to the British Empire. Old Edward Hobart Seymour gritted his teeth and fought with the Austrians for 3 days, hoping for a miracle to happen. However, the miracle did not happen, and he got nothing except more casualties and more failures. Instead of being content with occupying the center of the island, the Austrian army that landed on the island set its new target on the British military port. Even with the cover of warships, the defensive battle at the port was fierce. In fact, theoretically speaking, the Austrians did not bring many cannons with them when they landed on the island, and they should not have the ability to siege the city. However, the overwhelming amount of rockets broke their illusion. In the absence of mules and horses, a cannon of several hundred kilograms may not be able to be carried, but a rocket weighing more than 10 kilograms can still be carried around. Both the ancient buildings on Malta Island and the wooden structures of the port have almost zero protection against rockets at this time. Apart from the Austrian Empire, the main use of rockets was to burn buildings, so when the overwhelming rockets fell into the port, the British finally felt the despair of the Danes. Even though the sea was right next to them, even though the seawater was inexhaustible, they still couldn't extinguish the fire. Finally, after paying a very heavy price, Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. and the governor of Malta, Earl Salin, made a difficult decision. Abandon Malta. In the early morning, as the last cable was cut, the new Mediterranean fleet finally left this island full of blood and smoke. However, what awaited them was not the beautiful rising sun, but the main fleet of the Austrian navy that had been waiting for a long time. The fleet of the Austrian Empire slowly appeared from the distant horizon, and the black and gold flag slowly rose. Both sides knew that the moment of decisive battle had arrived. The sailors of the British new Mediterranean fleet had long thought out their bad feelings, and the soldiers of the Austrian navy had long been tired of eating salted fish on the beach. Since there was a famine in Sicily, the Austrian Empire's army could only eat dry food. Dry food and canned food are good things for the army, but in the eyes of the navy, dogs don't eat them. In particular, there are a large number of nobles from Italy in the Austrian navy. They are very picky about food, and the British opposite are undoubtedly the culprits. This was the first time Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. had seen the full picture of the Austrian Imperial Navy. The number and quality of the opponent's warships far exceeded his imagination. The number of warships alone is double the intelligence, not to mention that more than half of them are steam-powered giant ships, and there are even ironclad ships that are still in the experimental stage. At this time, the ironclads designed by the Austrian Empire were still very crude and primitive, but their protective power was no longer comparable to that of old battleships. Friedrich's flagship Prinz Eugen was fully equipped with the latest steel cannons. Its firepower could destroy a British warship with only 2 close-range salvos. The damage caused by the British warships was almost negligible. Neither blooming bullets nor solid bullets could penetrate its thick armor at this time. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. thought of a way, which was to directly attack the paddle wheel of the Prinz Eugen. The biggest weakness of steam battleships is the paddle wheel, so it has never received enough attention. However, the British gunners did not find the Austrian paddle wheel. After 6 hours of continuous fighting, Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. finally gave the order to retreat. But Friedrich obviously did not want to let them go, and led the Austrian Imperial Navy to pursue them. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. was in an unprecedented predicament, unable to fight, and unable to escape. Unless he can run to Gibraltar in one breath, the new Mediterranean fleet will definitely be annihilated in pursuit. Now Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. could only hope for a miracle. At this time, the lookout suddenly shouted, and another fleet appeared on the distant horizon. It's the French Grand Eastern Fleet. We are saved. Even Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. shed tears of emotion and hugged his men. Thank God. For the first time he believed that God existed. On the other side, Friedrich also had a smile on his face when he saw the flag of the French Grand Eastern Fleet there. Finally here. Chapter 990. The destruction of the British new Mediterranean Fleet. The French Grand Orient Fleet has 23 battleships, 4 of which have been overhauled. They are survivors of the last Mediterranean naval battle. 7 of the 11 battleships injured in the previous battle with the British were completely scrapped, not to mention the countless small and medium-sized ships that were destroyed, which greatly damaged the strength of the Great Eastern Fleet. However, the British could not control that much at this time, and the mere arrival of reinforcement was enough to make them ecstatic. The size of the French Grand Orient fleet still looks huge. After all, the leaders of the Second French Republic do not want to be underestimated by the British. Build another fleet in a short time. Of course this is impossible, but they can rent it or force it. After all, they are in the midst of an economic crisis at this time, and with the change of old and new dynasties, there are many reasons. With the support of the government of the Second French Republic, the sailors of the Grand Eastern Fleet were not polite, and brought over all the merchant ships that had evaded taxes, and owed taxes, but had no business with the government. As mentioned earlier, there was no insurmountable gap between large merchant ships and small and medium-sized warships at this time. The shipyard of the Great Eastern Fleet had more than 100 warships after simple modifications at this time. The Great Eastern Fleet looked like its sails were like clouds, blocking the sky. Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. and all the British sailors believed that the Austrian Imperial Navy would definitely retreat. Although the Austrian Navy seemed to have an absolute advantage at this time and had been chasing the British fleet, in fact the advantage was not as great as it seemed. Otherwise there would be no need to keep chasing the British fleet. Friedrich was of course confident that he could deal with the British in one fell swoop. But the Austrian Navy could not afford such losses. Moreover, such a style of play is inconsistent with Franz's strategy. This is the founding battle before Franz ascends the throne. He needs to ensure that the British will not continue to cause trouble to Austria for at least 5 years. The British new Mediterranean fleet rushed towards the French Grand Orient fleet without thinking. At this time, the British had only one idea in their mind: escape. As long as they join up with the French, their chances of survival will be greatly improved. Whether they fight against the Austrian fleet with the French or leave the French to escape alone. All the British ships were running away desperately, and those old ships were suddenly left behind. Naturally, the Austrian Navy would not miss this opportunity. After successive defeats, the British sailors' blood and morale were exhausted. Finally, the captain of the British ship Courageous decided to lower the original British Empire battle flag and raise the white flag to surrender to the Austrian Imperial Navy. However, the Austrian Navy seemed to have not seen the raised white flag and sent the old sailing battleship into the bottom of the sea with continuous salvos. In fact, before the war started, Friedrich had already warned with flags that this would be a death battle at sea. If he wanted to surrender, he would just leave the team and go to the shore. But no British warship did this at the time. So from the Austrian side's perspective, the British accepted this death battle by default. In the Age of Sail, there was a very complicated process for accepting the surrender of ships. The Austrian Empire was a traditional land power, and they missed that era perfectly. After its establishment, the Austrian Navy spent 99% of its time fighting pirates and river bandits. This was often a life and death battle, and they had no mature experience in surrendering. In addition, the reputation of the British Navy is really bad, so they don't do too many things like pretending to surrender and carrying out sneak attacks. Austria is a Catholic country and does not allow slaves, so the only way they deal with pirates is to kill them directly. Friedrich suffered a loss from the British during the last Mediterranean naval battle. After all, it is painful for any sailor who loves the ocean to watch a ship sink before his eyes. Therefore, the Austrian Navy had previously accepted the surrender of some ships of the British Navy. However, when the two sides were approaching to prepare for the surrender ceremony, the British sailors suddenly attacked and fired great bombs at close range, almost clearing the deck of the Austrian warship. Moreover, the Austrian Navy had no experience in boarding battles and was no match for the British sailors. In addition, almost all commanders from the captain on down were killed in the first attack. The Austrian warship that went to accept the surrender of the British Navy instead became take the opponent's spoils after the British ship that attempted to surrender sank. Other British warships that fell behind also suffered the same fate. However, Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. could not control that much at this time. He ordered the flag bearer to send a flag to the French Grand Eastern Fleet, hoping that the Grand Eastern Fleet would fight with them against the Austrians. The French flagship quickly issued a semaphore and agreed, but they did not make way for the British. Instead, they set up a battle formation point. It is normal for the French to ask the British not to retreat, but why did the French arrive so late? Before Edward Hobart Seymour Sr. had time to think, the French Grand Orient Fleet suddenly launched an attack on the British New Mediterranean Fleet. A salvo from the entire Great Eastern Fleet stunned the unsuspecting British. The reinforcement turned into enemies in an instant. The despair after experiencing hope was even more desperate. Moreover, neither Austria nor France had the intention to accept the surrender of the British. The mentally broken British army was quickly annihilated under the attack of the Austrian and French Grand Eastern fleets. At this time, the British captains, almost without exception, chose to die on the ship. Even the enemies of the Austrian Navy and the French Navy had to pay tribute to them for such behavior. Both Archduke Friedrich, commander of the Austrian Navy, and François Trouvier, commander of the French Grand Orient Fleet, walked onto the bridge to salute their opponents. The naval military bands of the two countries also played Chopin's Funeral March in unison, and the soldiers fired guns in their honor. But all British warships must be sunk. This is related to the survival of both countries. Friedrich did not regret it. If it happened again, he would still kill the British. However, not all British officers were so courageous. Old Edward Hobart Seymour stepped on a sampan and held up a white flag and his own ribbon. "I am the commander of the British Mediterranean Fleet. I demand surrender. You must protect my personal safety." François Trouvier, the commander of the French Grand Eastern Fleet, ignored the old guy. For François Trouvier, capturing the British commander was not an honor, but a trouble, so he chose to walk away. The British commander was also a trouble for Friedrich and Austria. It would be best if he died, but at this time, under the watch of the media, Friedrich directly threw down the cable and accepted the elder Edward Hobart Seymour of surrender. As for the surrender of other British sailors, Austria did not accept it, but gave them some boats, dry food and water, and returned them freedom. Afterwards, the Austrian Navy also chose to leave quickly. The Russian merchant ship nearby could not carry too many British sailors, so it quickly left, after loading dozens of people. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 991 Backstab. The remaining soldiers of the British New Mediterranean Fleet gathered together in famous boats to form a small fleet. Since most of the officers were killed on the ship, the remaining sailors soon started fighting for leadership. Some people proposed to go to Gibraltar, and some proposed to go to Cyprus, but the distance between the two places was too far, and it was unknown whether they could reach their destination alive. So someone suggested going to Sicily, or returning directly to Malta. However, they had already offended the other party by robbing Austrian merchant ships and selling grain to the Sicilians at high prices. Now they will definitely be retaliated against when they go to Sicily. It is not a wise move to return to Malta Island. There is a high probability that they will be treated as spies by the Austrians patrolling the coast or directly hunted by enemy troops trying to land on the island. After all, they have done this before. The remaining option is France, but they still don't know why the Great Eastern Fleet, which was originally an ally, suddenly attacked them. However, they didn't have much time to discuss. Suddenly another fleet appeared on the sea. This fleet was all Arab-style clippers. After discovering them, they quickly approached them. The remaining British sailors were a little confused, but they were not panicked. After all, the Ottomans were allies of the British most of the time. But the Arab sailors did not come to the British's rescue, but aimed the ship's cannons and muskets at the latter's small sampan. At this time, the British sailors had absolutely no power to fight back, and because they were unprepared before, their small fleet was quickly wiped out. The Arab sailors didn't seem to want to let them go. They waved various harpoons into the water, and soon the nearby sea was dyed red. The thick bloody smell attracted a large number of predators hidden deep in the ocean, and the British New Mediterranean Fleet mysteriously disappeared again. Also missing was the Grand Orient Fleet of the Second French Republic, while Austria trumpeted its Adriatic fleet's victory on the island of Malta. Afterwards, Friedrich led the fleet to Cyprus. The British Army here did not have the courage of the elite North Sea Fleet, and they chose to surrender almost immediately. The British and French governments did not believe in the Austrian naval victory. However, it is an indisputable fact that Malta and Cyprus fell one after another, and the whereabouts of the new Mediterranean fleet are unknown. The Second French Republic is also unable to contact its Grand Eastern Fleet, and it seems unlikely that two of the world's top fleets will disappear together. London, 10 Downing Street. John Russell slapped the Times down on his desk. Gentlemen, I want to know what is going on. Who is lying? Lord Admiralty George Eden and Foreign Secretary Palmerston looked at each other and saw surprise and suspicion in each other's eyes, because neither side can be sure that the information in their hands is true, but they only have this information. Your Majesty Prime Minister, I think we should give our intelligence personnel a little more time. The words of Lord Admiral George Eden ignited John Russell's anger. When? The Austrians' newspapers have been sent to England. And where are our intelligence officers? What are they doing? If their news comes later than the newspapers, then I don't think our intelligence agency needs to exist. John Russell's words left George Eden speechless. After all, the rumors that the Intelligence Bureau, which spends a lot of money, always lags behind the media every time is really embarrassing. But Palmerston had a different view. He cleared his throat and said, "The Times always gets information before our intelligence agency. This must be due to collusion between them and foreign forces. I propose to strictly investigate the Times and formulate new regulations to rectify the newspaper industry." In fact, the Times, which was paid to do things, did offend a lot of people, so a series of new regulations on the newspaper industry were passed in the British Parliament without much resistance. However, the Times has not been shut down. Who said the back end is strong enough? The problem of public opinion is easy to solve. After all, the British are most concerned about the economic crisis and the spreading famine at this time. Due to the shrinking European and North American markets, the piracy problem of the Qing dynasty, the rise of new forces in the Southeast Asia, the rebellion of Indian princes, as well as the decline in the global share of British products and lack of competitiveness, etc. The economic crisis of the British at this time is more serious than at the same time in history. Natural disasters continue throughout the British Isles, and the impact of late potato blight is no longer limited to Ireland. Farms in Scotland, Wales, and England are also suffering from the same problem. However, historically, because the British government imported a large amount of grain from the United States and squeezed the Irish area to the extreme, the disaster in the UK did not seem to be serious. However, as the border dispute remained unresolved at this time, the US government put pressure on Britain through food and cotton issues. Britain once thought of using other ways to solve the problem, but the war with Austria disrupted everything. At this time, it was simply impossible for the British to send another army to put pressure on the Americans in Ireland. Rebellions and anti-tax riots continued. At the same time, a large number of people began to flee with their families. The overpopulated island of Ireland actually experienced a shortage of labor at the same time. The problem of the Chartists in the UK has never been resolved, which led to the radicalization of the Chartists, workers going on strike, and miners refusing to go down the mines. Since the establishment of the London Working Men's Association in 1836, workers' associations have mushroomed all over the UK. In early 1848, representatives of the British Workers' Association went to Paris to meet the two pioneers and witness the February Revolution in France. And some British trade union representatives feel that Britain can also follow France's example, because there are more workers in the UK and they live a harder life than French workers. As recently as April 6, 1848, a large-scale Chartist movement broke out in Britain. John Russell didn't have any good solutions. He could only catch them. Although the Chartists seemed to have settled down a lot after that, there was still a lingering ghost in the hearts of the British government. In this moment of internal and external troubles, the disappearance of the new Mediterranean fleet is not so conspicuous, but no matter what, the British Empire of Malta and Cyprus could not afford to lose. And they all know in their hearts that the new Mediterranean fleet is probably doomed, but no one is willing to bear this responsibility. The Austrian record is indeed amazing. But fortunately the British Empire has a great cause, and it is not a problem to organize an expeditionary fleet to completely eliminate the Austrian navy. The only problem is that they don't know how and at what cost. The Austrians won. However, they soon received even greater bad news. The French Grand Eastern Fleet did not disappear, but chose to betray the Second French Republic. Chapter 992, Abandoning Darkness and Turning to Light. The betrayal of the Grand Eastern Fleet was undoubtedly a heavy blow to the Second French Republic. The fleet was too important to a country. After losing the Great Eastern Fleet, let alone cooperate with the British Empire to block the coast of the Austrian Empire and defeat the royalist rebels to regain Algeria, even their own safety cannot be guaranteed. If the Grand Eastern Fleet and the Austrians attack France's Mediterranean coast in turn, it will undoubtedly be worse for the French economy. What's even more terrible is that the Great Eastern Fleet did not surrender to the Austrians, but joined the ranks of the Orleans remnants at this time. The Second French Republic, let alone annihilating the rebels and regaining Algeria, might be counterattacked by the remnants of Orleans and invade the homeland. At this time, the Duke of Ormuz, the fourth son of Louis Philippe, had an army of 100,000 men and a powerful maritime force such as the Great Eastern Fleet. Coupled with the powerful ally of the Austrian Empire, the princes in the parliament of the Second French Republic all pointed their fingers at D'Angela and the national newspaper faction who were determined to launch a war. In fact, long before the war began, the senior officials of the Great Eastern Fleet strongly opposed the war, and even opposed joining forces with the British. Not only was it a century-old feud with the British, but it was also the blood debt between the French Navy and the British Navy. The former commander of the Great Eastern Fleet, Bucquet Renaud, died in the First Mediterranean naval battle with the British. In addition, almost all the officers and soldiers of the Great Eastern Fleet had relatives or friends who died at the hands of the British. The bones of their relatives and friends are still cold, and now they are asked to join forces with their former enemies. And the officers and soldiers of the Great Eastern Fleet cannot accept it emotionally. In the end, the Grand Eastern Fleet and even the entire French Navy were dissatisfied with the Second French Republic. There are mainly 2 points. There are a large number of aristocratic hereditary officers in the First Navy. They themselves are not interested in the Republic, and even naturally hate the so-called democracy. The second and most critical point is that the financial situation of the Second French Republic has always been very poor, and arrears in military pay and maintenance funds are almost commonplace. With the exception of a few hereditary officers, most in the Navy are still waiting for military pay to support their families. If it were a case of defaulting on some military pay and funds, it would not necessarily cause such a big response, but in the context of the dual effects of the economic crisis and the food crisis, it is almost impossible for naval officers and soldiers not to be angry. Not to mention the chaos within France at this time, rampant corruption, alternation of old and new, intertwined contradictions, coupled with the huge pressure brought by the war, finally triggered the dissatisfaction of the Great Eastern Fleet. The officers and soldiers of the Great Eastern Fleet did not feel that this was a betrayal, but turned to the light. In their eyes, the Second French Republic was the conqueror, and they were the defenders of order and dynasty. As for destroying the British, that is their duty. Before the war began, they sent their families and property to the port of Toulon. Then, in the name of military expansion and war preparations, merchant ships were recruited and converted into transport ships to transport one's own personnel and materials. Even their frequent trips between the Algerian ports of Oran and the French ports of Toulon did not arouse much suspicion. Even if they drove away 2 unfinished warships and took away more than 2,000 bewildered shipbuilders for the last time, after all, these assets themselves belonged to the Great Eastern Fleet. When news of the naval battle in the Mediterranean reached Paris and the government of the Second French Republic discovered that something was wrong, the entire port of Toulon was evacuated. Navy Minister Agra wanted to take the blame and resign, but D'Angela did not want to let this unlucky guy go, even though he had no knowledge of the mutiny. In fact, Minister of the Navy Agra is a very talented person. He has long seen the problems of the Second French Republic, but he is powerless. After all, he cannot betray his own class. As for the mutiny of the Great Eastern Fleet, it was naturally impossible for this minister, who had never even been to Paris, to know what was going on. In the end, Minister Regret was sentenced to 300 years in prison. The government of the Second French Republic tried its best to suppress the impact of the mutiny of the Grand Eastern Fleet, but the people's patience with the French government was almost reaching its limit. In addition to suppressing domestic public opinion and national sentiment, D'Angelo also sent his own envoy to Britain with his own handwritten letter to seek help. He hoped that Britain could send troops to help France destroy the Algerian rebels. That's it, Mr. Russell. The evil Orleans dynasty is still lingering. Mr. D'Angelo hopes that your country can send another expeditionary force. At that time, our country will send the Great Western Fleet to cooperate with your army. The words of French envoy Tubase Randall made the British dignitaries in Whitehall feel a little stunned. Send another fleet, or go with the French? Do the French want to do it again? Even if the British Empire had a great cause, they could not withstand such troubles unless they can send a super fleet that is confident enough to defeat the navies of France and Austria. But even the British Empire could only organize such a fleet once at this time. If it fails again this time, let alone competing with Russia for world hegemony, it is unknown whether it can maintain its current maritime hegemony. The continued dispatch of the expeditionary force requires congressional approval. In addition, our country also needs to further confirm the status of the new Mediterranean fleet. John Russell just made some excuses, which made the French envoy Tubase Randall very depressed. Mr. Russell, I hope you know that the price we pay in France is no smaller than yours. The betrayal of the Great Eastern Fleet means that more than half of our country's coastal defense forces have become minions of the rebels. Our army is also fighting with all its strength against Austria and its servants, with casualties already reaching tens of thousands. But even so, our country still has not given up. For the sake of peace and justice in this world, and for those innocent people to be spared the suffering of war, we should continue to shoulder the responsibility of a great power. Therefore, our country hopes that your country can send troops to attack the Austrian mainland as soon as possible and assist us in France to sweep away the rebels who colluded with the Austrians. French envoy Tubase Randall said something so righteous that he almost moved himself to tears. Palmerston exchanged a look with John Russell and then said, Mr. Randall, how come I heard that all four armies of your country are in a stalemate with the Austrians? It can't be such a coincidence, right? Although Palmerston's questioning made Tubase Randall angry. In Europe, where there were many autocratic monarchies, only Britain could help the Second French Republic, and only Britain had this strength. Tubase Randall said quickly, our army has opened up a situation in Belgium. It's okay that he didn't mention Belgium. When he mentioned Belgium, the British ministers in Whitehall looked a little ugly. Chapter 993 Chaos Life. Belgium was originally a wedge for the British Empire to penetrate the European continent. However, due to the activity of an ant, this wedge was removed, which put the British Empire in an unprecedented passive diplomatic position. The diplomatic environment conducive to the British Empire was gone forever, and almost every British diplomatic incident since then was a disaster, including the anti-imperialist alliance. At this time, the undefeated troops commanded by our own undefeated generals had a bad start, and their whereabouts are still unknown. The French are working very hard, but it is an indisputable fact that their Great Eastern Fleet stabbed the British new Mediterranean Fleet in the back. As for Poland, Serbia, and the Ottomans, there was no news. The British Foreign Office has sent people to urge the three countries to join the war as soon as possible. After Tubase Randall returned to Paris, he told D'Angelo what the British said and their attitude. The new leader of the nationalist faction, the actual head of the Second French Republic at this time, immediately came to the conclusion that France was not sincere enough to impress the British. So he immediately issued orders to various war zones through Congress to win quickly. However, he naturally did not say that he wanted to let the British see their own value, but that he wanted to show the style of the French nation and reflect the superiority of the new system compared to the old system. Brussels, Belgium. Henry Arson slowly put down the exquisite royal porcelain in his hand, then crumpled the latest order from Paris into a ball and threw it aside casually. Your Majesty General, this is an order from Congress. The adjutant on the side quickly picked it up and said, how many of those idiots in Congress know military knowledge? How many of those so-called generals have attended military schools? Why should I obey their orders, Henry? Arson's series of questions left the adjutants and staff in the hall speechless. He was very satisfied with everyone's expressions, and then asked himself, I am the supreme commander on the battlefield, and I know very well that no one knows better than me how to win. A qualified general's only duty is to win, not to curry favor with stupid superiors and ridiculous politicians. Henry Arson sat back in his chair and looked sideways at the crowd. And you just have to obey. Yes, sir. The officers under Henry Arson still admired him very much, because among the 5 French armies at this time, only they had the most victories with the smallest losses. Report on the latest battle situation. Yes, Your Excellency General. Yesterday General Oda defeated the Dutch Antwerp army at the De River. He should have entered the city of Ghent by now. Our recovery of East Flanders is just around the corner. Another staff officer stood up. His expression was not good. The troops of the German Confederacy invaded from multiple directions, and General Medis has repelled 9 enemy attacks. Henry Arson didn't take it seriously. Of the 5 lines of defense I deployed, how many did they break through? The staff officer scratched his head and said awkwardly, there is not one yet. Then what do you have to worry about? But the number of the German allied forces is at least 3 times that of ours, and you allocate half of your troops to General Aldo to attack the Netherlands. It's just a ragtag bunch, nothing to worry about. I'm fishing, catching a big fish. This big fish deliberately released Brussels to us, hoping that we would follow his wishes and walk step by step towards the trap he designed. If it were my group of colleagues who were stupid, arrogant and didn't like reading, they would probably have entered his circle by now. But unfortunately I'm not. I want to put an end to that old era. Sarburg. La Massilia looked at the orders on the table, then at the demoralized soldiers outside, and he spread his hands. When the morale of the army is restored, we will take the initiative. In addition, please tell Mr. Dingler and all members of Congress that our army has regained the Lorraine area. At this time, the hands of the clock pointed to 11 o'clock, and the sound of artillery sounded on time outside. The German allied forces would bombard outside for 2 hours between 11 and 1 o'clock every day. At first, the French army thought it was a pre-war preparation by the German allied forces, but in fact it seemed to be just a routine matter. After the first day of the battle, the German allied forces never launched an attack again. The officers did not understand why the dominant German allied forces did not launch an attack. Because the longer the delay was, the more detrimental it would be to the German allied forces. But Le Massilia seemed to understand something. He still had some understanding of the German allied forces. The so-called German allied forces are actually a patchwork of troops from various German states. If they work hard and with enthusiasm, they might be able to fight. But when their minds are calm, they will worry about gains and losses, and hesitate to move forward. After all, they are only temporary allies. After the war is over, they will still be wary of each other. In fact, Le Massilia discovered the problem in the previous battle. Both the front row and those responsible for the pursuit were Austrian soldiers. However, the commander of this army is an Austrian after all, and he is also a member of the royal family. It is normal for them to regard the army as their own property and not want to consume it. Most of the commanders of other countries also have this mentality, so they would rather do these useless efforts than try to win. The most important thing is that Saarburg is still a fortress anyway. At this time, the French army is undoubtedly in a superior terrain, and the German allied forces still have a low chance of winning, even if they desperately try. Now Le Massilia's idea is to keep Saarburg impregnable, and then wait for the German allied forces to crash into it. Celesta City. Bonneau de Cullen could only smile bitterly when he saw the order coming from Paris. The dark German allied forces outside were searching for the French soldiers who were hiding. Royal Palace of Turin. As an excellent political worker, Bellevue naturally speaks very well. After expressing his determination impassionately, he told the special envoy from Paris that the Italian corps would take over northern Italy as soon as possible to reassure Paris. A military parade in the morning, a banquet in the afternoon, and a dance in the evening. Food, wine, beautiful women, as well as some priceless works of art and precious metals were clearly arranged for the special envoy. Austria Vienna. Promoting peace through fighting has always been Franz's diplomatic principle. The Austrian Navy's victory in the Mediterranean was naturally not to anger the British, but to communicate with them in a way that was easier for them to understand. The composition of the diplomatic mission sent by the Austrian Empire to Britain is also very interesting. There were only a few diplomats in the entire mission. On the contrary, the delegation was led by Baron Karl von Bruck, Chancellor of Finance of the Austrian Empire and President of the Imperial Central Bank. The members of the mission were a large number of bankers and actuaries, including Luce and Sinner, the President of the Austrian Federation of Industry and Commerce, the President of the Artists Consortium, and economists such as the Old Bumbork. Chapter 994 Siege. Sylvester. Bonneau de Cullen wanted to have a bloody battle with the main force, led by Franz in the ruins. However, Franz did not want to kill too many French people, because it seemed meaningless to him. However, Franz's request made things difficult for his staff. At this time, the German allied forces had an absolute advantage. At the same time, there were residents of Sylvester City as internal agents. It was only time to annihilate the French army. The staff had countless ways to kill all the French, but it was difficult to send these French back to France safely. The strength of the French army in Sylvester City is unknown. Although a large number of hot air balloons were sent for reconnaissance, it was impossible to confirm the number of enemy troops due to the obstruction of the buildings. As for the captured prisoners, their confessions were also different. The information did not match up at all, so it was impossible to judge the authenticity. This made the Austrian reconnaissance troops very depressed, because they had never encountered such a ghost situation, and the information provided by each French prisoner was different. The most important thing is that, based on their experience, these French prisoners did not lie. The final data given by the coalition intelligence department was that the number of French troops in Sylvester City ranged from 40,000 to 80,000. In fact, Bonneau de Cullen didn't know how many troops he still had at this time, because the previous battle was defeated too quickly. In addition, the fighting in the city has never stopped. At this time, the French army in Sylvester City was extremely chaotic, so the French prisoners could not explain clearly. Franz has always believed that professional matters should be left to professionals. Before he came, he recruited 10 people from each of the 3 major military academies of the Austrian Empire and 20 senior staff officers from the army. Coupled with the military talents of the vassal states and the German Confederation, Franz felt that these 100 elites would be able to give him a satisfactory answer. In fact, he was more concerned about whether Friedrich's navy could defeat the British's new Mediterranean fleet than the European battlefield. Although it can be said that Franz did almost everything in order to win this naval battle, nearly 10 years of preparation, coupled with various new weapons and tactics, buying, bribing, and even inciting British allies to rebel. Everything is for this naval battle, but we are still not completely sure. There are too many variables in a naval battle. If Britain's new Mediterranean fleet cannot be annihilated, Austria will fall into endless troubles. The war may drag on for 1 or 2 years, and the Crimean War may even start in advance. When the news of the victory in the Mediterranean naval battle came, everyone in the German coalition looked in disbelief, and then became ecstatic. Victory, long live, we are invincible. Then, there was the sound of beep, pop pop champagne being opened. Fortunately, this is a champagne production area. Fortunately, local celebrities had just sent a batch of champagne, otherwise it would not be enough for these guys to waste. This time, even Franz raised his wine glass for a rare occasion. Seeing the nominal supreme commander of the coalition raise his wine glass, everyone immediately fell silent and waited for Franz's lecture. However, Franz did not want to spoil everyone's good mood by making a long speech. In addition, his identity and position determined that he was not suitable to speak more on this occasion. Gentlemen, here's to the victory, to victory. Even if Franz didn't say anything, his identity and status alone were enough to detonate the atmosphere at this time. The news quickly spread throughout the army, and the Austrian navy completely annihilated the invincible British Empire fleet in the Mediterranean naval battle, which made the soldiers of the coalition very excited. Not to mention the Austrian soldiers. There were a large number of nationalists in the armies of the German states at this time, and they would naturally be proud of Austria's achievements. After all, Austria was the leader of the German states at this time, and their sentiment quickly spread among the army. The German allied forces outside the city of Celesta cheered, and the French army inside the city looked confused. Fortunately, this was not the first time. They only regarded this as some special habit of the Germans. It's just that some noble officers and soldiers who understand German don't look very good. How is it possible that the Austrian Navy defeated the British Navy? But if this is true, does it make sense for them to continue to garrison Celesta City? But before they could be frightened and confused, the German Allied Forces attack began. The staff group of the German Allied Forces finally came to only one conclusion regarding Franz's request, which was to fight first and then talk later. The German Allied Forces first used reconnaissance hot air balloons to identify the relatively weak points of the French army's defense, and then sent skirmishers to feign attacks in other directions. They waited until the French army was attracted by the skirmishers, then used heavy artillery and rockets to greet them, and at the same time, sent the main force to defend the French army. Attack the weak points. Since the Austrian reconnaissance balloons cannot be eliminated, the French can only keep fighting enemies with the entire map open. This made the French army in Celesta City extremely frustrated. On the one hand, they had to be careful about being called out by the coalition skirmishers, and on the other hand, they had to reduce their gathering to avoid being greeted by the coalition's firepower, and no matter how hard they tried to move, the battle was always very passive. The coalition forces had an absolute advantage, so they were not in a hurry. The staff divided the French army's position into hundreds of pieces, and they were ready to eat them piece by piece. As for Franz's order to reduce casualties, they chose to selectively ignore it. At most, they only symbolically asked whether to surrender before the final attack, and gave the other party 10 seconds to think about it. Many French soldiers were killed before they could figure out what the German allies said. There are many people in the German allied forces who can speak French, but most of them are officers, while the top soldiers only know the dialect of their hometown or 20 words on the battlefield. Therefore, this style of fighting almost never captures prisoners. The tactics are very successful. The French have no countermeasures. France will surrender in a week or two at most. However, Franz still stopped this method of fighting. On the one hand, it was too costly to weapons and troops, and on the other hand, the French would definitely be annihilated if they continued to fight like this at this time. The Austrian frontline commanders were all confused, but since it was an order, they would execute it immediately. Colonel Helt is the commander of the 46th Infantry Regiment in Graz. His regiment is one of the earliest elite units to receive new weapons and street fighting simulation training. With the help of new weapons, new equipment, new tactics, and full-scale hot air balloons, Colonel Helt did not feel that street fighting was cruel. Instead, he felt that the French were a bunch of pigs who could not move or run around. Go. To the reserve team. Are you going to end the battle in one fell swoop before formal orders arrive? The adjutant asked cautiously. The so-called formal order is actually one of the stubborn problems of the Austrian Imperial Army. There has been an unwritten rule in the Austrian Imperial Army since the Middle Ages. Officers above the regimental level have the right to question their superiors and refuse to execute orders from their superiors. They require secondary confirmation before executing them. This is the so-called formal order, but after Archduke Charles's military reforms and a series of disastrous defeats in the anti-French war, few people emphasized this right anymore. Franz felt that the original purpose of the Austrian Empire's acquiescence in its existence should be to win over the small nobles and monks who had fallen with the wind. But over time it became a cancer that was difficult to remove. Chapter 995 Fanny Coat. Transportation and communications in the past were not comparable to modern times. Signal soldiers might have to travel for several days to get an order. Going back and forth would take 3 times as long. But this also explains to some extent why the Austrian Imperial Army can always be so defeated. What? Official order? This is not only an order from our military headquarters, but also the highest order from the commander-in-chief of the German allied forces. Immediately go to the reserve team to build a defense and let the soldiers on the front line come back to rest. As you command. As a result, the French army in Celesta City became even more confused. Suddenly, the attack almost stopped. The newly arrived German allied soldiers began to dig ditches and build walls. As soon as they came up point, this makes the already riddled city even more dilapidated. Blanqui, who was waiting on the bell tower of the cathedral in the city center to lead the Celesta militia to counterattack, was very confused after seeing it. What's going on? Why don't you fight again, Bono? De Cullen and Blanqui sighed in their hearts at the same time. Bono de Cullen was initially disoriented by the Austrian grid-style attack. He felt as if he was fighting dozens of opponents at the same time. The German coalition launched attacks from several different areas, and then the coalition forces would change their strategies in a very short period of time every time the French command took corresponding countermeasures. In particular, the precise timing of the shelling made Bono de Cullen feel that these shelters in the city were simply useless whenever the French support troops left their bunkers to reinforce an area that was under attack. The German allied forces' artillery and rockets would accurately fall on that area. What's even more hateful is that whenever the smoke clears, they can't find the German allied forces immediately. Other areas were in crisis. In less than a day, more than a dozen important defensive areas were lost, and Bono de Cullen's reserve team also lost a quarter, but his intuition told him that the real attack had not yet begun. Suddenly the Austrian attack stopped and began to build fortifications inexplicably again, which made him have to suspect that there was a bigger conspiracy waiting for him. The morale of the French soldiers, who had never won a victory since the beginning of the war, fell to the bottom. In addition to losing consecutive battles, lack of medical treatment and food shortages were also important reasons. The Second French Republic was unable to provide sufficient supplies due to its poor economic conditions coupled with the previous high-intensity operations. Bono de Cullen's supplies were already below the red line point, although his choice to enter Celesta City was commendable for his courage. It seemed to be a bad move among bad moves at this time, because it was impossible for the supply team to break through the German allied forces' defense line. The supply team directly brought people and goods, plus horses and vehicles, which became the spoils of war for the coalition forces. Although the supply team had a certain amount of armed escort, they had no ability to resist facing the coalition's large cavalry. Most members of the supply team chose to surrender, and only a handful of courageous people chose to escape, but the price was a guaranteed beating, and some unlucky ones even lost their lives due to the influence of modern warfare. Franz's emphasis on supplies has reached an abnormal level, so he is very confused about the increasing supply of supplies at this time. Colonel Monta jumped out and very proudly explained to Franz how they captured the French supply team. Franz only gave one comment after hearing this: catch rabbits, Archduke. Franz, do you want to hunt? You are indeed very interested. However, the French royal hunting ground was burned by the Alsace. Franz looked helplessly at the future commander of the Forbidden Army in front of him, then looked at Bordeaux, who was smelling everywhere, and couldn't help but sigh. As a result, this sigh was caught by the keen Colonel Monta, and he immediately changed his words. There is a relatively empty camp to the east. We just need to circle it around and put some rabbits in it. Franz interrupted his poor flattery with a kick. It would be better for such a person to accept orders directly. However, for safety reasons, Franz still asked Colonel Monta's adjutant to report the details to the staff headquarters, hoping that no important details would be missed. After Franz issued the order to stop the attack, the staff of the general staff and the representatives of the various states became a little unable to sit still. They could not understand what Franz's purpose was, but they did not dare to disobey Franz's orders. Whether it was the nobles of the German states or those who were German nationalists, they had to worry about Franz's identity and influence. However, the Orleans dynasty's Confederate army was different. They did not want to give those traitors a chance to breathe. As a result, the Orleans dynasty's army launched a massive attack on the city of Celesta. However, their combat effectiveness was much worse than that of the Austrian army that had previously been responsible for the main attack. The brutal street fighting soon drove them back, and Bono de Cullen's army finally got a chance to breathe. These Frenchmen loyal to the Orleans dynasty treated the soldiers of the Second French Republic even more extreme than the most extreme German nationalists. They can't satisfy them even by applying wounds to corpses. The soldiers of the Second French Republic who fall into their hands will be tortured inhumanely before death. Even after death, they will be burned to ashes and then buried deep like non-degradable garbage. Buried underground. The Orleans army, which had just been beaten to disgrace in the street fighting, turned around and lodged a protest with the Allied forces headquarters. This was within Franz's expectation. What surprised him was that the commander of the Orleans army was actually a woman. Duchess Fanny Cote, a young widow who inherited a large inheritance. Originally supposed to be a victim of a family, the Cote family suffered unprecedented catastrophe during the French Revolution. The old Duke Cote even worked as a castrator during his escape. Even after the Bourbon Restoration, they remained desperately poor. During the Orleans dynasty, everything was more about money, and the Cote family was completely in decline. Finally, the old Duke Cote reached an agreement with a wealthy businessman. The old Duke would marry his daughter to the wealthy businessman, and the Cote family would receive a generous reward to continue the family's image in the upper class in this era of alternation between old and new. Fanny Cote is just one of the countless poor victims. Fortunately, her husband and father died suddenly, making Fanny Cote a rich and noble lady. Before the February Revolution, Fanny Cote's salon was always full of suitors. After the fall of the Orleans dynasty, Fanny Cote did not embrace the new government like other ladies who presided over the salon. Instead, she chose to follow the footsteps of her idol and sold her property and came to Strasbourg. Fanny Cote's idol is Joan of Arc, who ended the 100 Years' War between England and France. Chapter 996. Fanny Cote's experience was legendary enough, and more importantly, she carried enough gold and silver that Louis Philippe naturally accepted all who came. At the same time, he also needed to set an example for his followers. Although Louis Philippe did not have much profound political wisdom, there was actually no shortage of smart people around him. Thiers, for example, was a smart and shameless guy, but what cannot be ignored is that his political wisdom far exceeded those of the guys sitting in the Paris Assembly Hall at this time. Under Thiers' planning, Louis Philippe chose to meet Fanny Cote in Metz, naming her deputy commander-in-chief of the Orleans army and ordering her to garrison Strasbourg. In addition, Duchess Fanny Cote was allowed to recruit and train an army loyal to Louis Philippe himself. The so-called deputy commander is actually not an official position, but more like an honorary title. Strasbourg, at the time, seemed like a place where war was absolutely impossible. As for recruiting and training new soldiers, the Orleans government did not give her money, food, or equipment. Even the trained troops must be loyal to the royal family in the end. Thiers' actions can be said to have brought his shameless political style to the limit, but Franz knew very well that Thiers could be even more shameless as long as he had the opportunity. However, this Fanny Cote still has some abilities. The 30,000 Orleans troops in the coalition at this time are the best proof. 30,000 troops seemed like nothing in the eyes of great powers like Austria and France, but at this time the combined population of Alsace and Lorraine was less than 1 million. Therefore, this Fanny Cote is still very influential and popular locally. There is a word that is very suitable to describe the equipment of this army of the Orleans dynasty at this time made by all nations. The main rifle of this army was the Charleville 1777 flintlock, and the rest were donations from German states. The donations from various states, except for a few small states such as Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and Frankfurt, were all clearing out stocks. The Dutch even sent matchlock guns that required flint and ammunition pouches, even though the equipment was extremely poor, and even though she had to bring her own dry food and mules and horses. Fanny Cote brought this army to the battlefield. Franz still admired her for this. The door of the command post was pushed open. Yes, it was a door. In addition to the door, Franz had all kinds of furniture, including 2 coffee machines and a bookshelf. In the past few days, the coalition engineering troops built a headquarters and a single family wooden villa for Franz. A tall woman with slender thighs walked in with firm steps. She was wearing the common officer uniform of the Orleans dynasty, which was mainly blue, white, and gold. The military uniform designed specifically for men looked surprisingly good on her, especially the combination of white tights and black riding boots, which looked more pleasing to Franz, a modern man, than on a group of older men. The mountains on her chest were tightly bound by the double-breasted coat, which made her look even more majestic. The medals and ribbons hanging nearby seemed a little more proud. There was nothing hanging on his waist, and the sword and gun were probably taken away before entering the door. After all, Franz has a special status, so he still needs to take minimum safety precautions. Looking at the outfit, the woman in front of me is the famous Duchess. Fanny Coat has a pair of hazel eyes with thin and long eyelashes, which makes her appear strong yet tender. The short hair is particularly conspicuous, and the cuts are not neat. Needless to say, she probably cut it herself, or even cut it with a knife point. Overall, Franz's first impression of the Duchess was not bad, but he soon discovered that the Joan of Arc in front of him was more like a clumsy imitator. The first thing Fanny Coat did after entering Franz's temporary headquarters was to take a careful look at Colonel Bordeaux, Colonel Monta, and even Zeduokize. Historically, the French Crown Prince Charles deliberately had someone pretend to be himself in order to test Joan of Arc. Sorry, we are on the battlefield right now, and we don't have time to play such boring games. It wasn't until Franz pointed it out that Fanny Coat looked away angrily. Hello, Your Highness Dauphin. No, Archduke Franz. Dauphin is actually a special name for the Crown Prince in France. Generally speaking, foreigners cannot understand it, but Franz is just not that common. Seeing this scene, he couldn't help complaining in his heart. It seems that this cosplayer hasn't had enough fun yet. However, he still smiled politely and awkwardly on the surface, and Fanny Coat returned the same awkward smile. In fact, generally speaking, there is no problem in calling the prince the Crown Prince, but Franz's situation is a little different. His father is not the emperor, but his uncle is. Moreover, the meanings of Crown Prince and Crown Prince are also different. Would you like wine or tea? Of course, we also have coffee and mint water here. Europe is still very hot in July, and mint water, a heat clearing drink, is also very popular. I would like to ask you why you stopped attacking. Our enemy will not be able to hold on any longer. But Fanny Coat was obviously not in that mood. She said straight to the point. The invaders of the Second French Republic have lost the ability to continue expanding, and we should avoid senseless killings. Franz was well prepared, and his response was naturally very high sounding. In fact, what he had in mind was that France should not be weakened too much, otherwise he would be the next Napoleon, and a large anti-Austrian alliance would cover the entire Europe. Franz had to face a situation where he was surrounded by enemies on all sides. Most of his hard work over the years would be in vain, or even become someone else's wedding dress. Domestic reforms will go backwards, and high pressure rule will have to be implemented in order to gather combat power and stabilize people's hearts. Franz's enemies can fail countless times, but as long as he fails once, he will be completely liquidated, and the conflicts that have been suppressed for many years will explode. But Fanny Coat didn't know this. She still said reluctantly, "We have warned the intruders, and I have personally written to Bonodi, Cullen and Angela. I told them that if they don't lay down their weapons and leave the land of Orleans immediately before the war, then they will all die here. I can't break my oath." Franz was speechless for a while, and couldn't help but continue to complain. Why are you still making the pre-war declaration and really think of yourself as Joan of Arc? Did he break his oath and commit suicide on the banks of the Rhine? Too embarrassed to meet the elders in Hexy? Alsace is west of the Rhine, and what does the promise you, Fanny Coat, made on behalf of the Orleans government have to do with me, Franz, the commander-in-chief of the German Allied forces? After thinking about it, Franz continued to speak in an official tone. Enough. Blood has been shed. The vast majority of soldiers are innocent. They are just lambs held hostage by a few ambitious people. Forgive me for not agreeing with your point of view. Ignorance and innocence cannot be used as an excuse for them to become intruders. On the contrary, we should apply the hammer of justice to them, so that the truly innocent dead can rest in peace and the living can live in peace of mind. The more Fanny Coat talked, the more excited she became. Her chest was rising and falling violently, especially the 2 rows of tight buttons that seemed about to collapse at any time. Chapter 997. Fanny Coat's determination. Her breathing became rapid, perhaps from being buttoned too tightly, or perhaps from the fact that the men's military uniforms bust didn't quite fit her size. The men on the side generally moved their eyes 45 degrees downward, and their breathing became rapid. Franz was completely unmoved, which aroused the admiration of the 2 girls in the room. But what they didn't know was that Franz had seen something even more exciting. Bordeaux looked away and coughed twice. His intention was clearly to remind Fanny Coat of his words and attitude. I will not sacrifice my soldiers in vain, but you can rest assured that I will drive the invaders of the Second French Republic out of Alsace. Franz made an unlimited promise, which was a reassurance to the other party and a step back point, but this obviously did not satisfy Fanny Coat. Archduke Franz, I'm very disappointed in you. I heard that you are a born saint, a role model for royal children, the greatest scientist and investor of this century, a true philanthropist and a martyr, but I don't think so. I think you're just a hypocritical bastard. It happened that a waiter came in with wine, and Fanny Coat excitedly grabbed it and drank it, and then said angrily, "Thank you for the wine. We French people will protect our own people. We don't need help from others, and we won't hide here and sit back." Fanny Coat's behavior was enough to cause a lot of trouble for her and the entire Orleans dynasty. Bordeaux even felt that she should be detained and tortured to find out if anyone was behind it. However, Franz is not that small-minded yet, and he will not blackmail others with this, but he still can't help complaining in his heart. Your army is all German, and most of the food and supplies are donated by us. It's a shame you can say such a thing. Franz already had a countermeasure in mind for the defenders in Celeste City, but he still needed the help of his staff to repair possible loopholes. In fact, Franz had already sent people to spread rumors before that, claiming that the German allied forces would enter the Upper Rhine province. The Upper Rhine province is in the south of Alsace, and this is enough for Bonneau de Cullen to think about it, because the Upper Rhine province has a developed water system, and at the same time, has no troops to defend. Colmar's defense is not even as good as Celeste, let alone mercenaries and militia fight to the death. That's right, Franz plans to directly bypass Celeste and attack France's vulnerable rear. This will make Bonneau de Cullen's defense a joke, and it will also be easy to win the consent of the German Confederation. However, Franz was awakened by a commotion early the next morning. When he finished dressing, he found that there was already a lot of people outside, and groups of officers and soldiers were gathering together to discuss something. "Bordeaux, what's going on?" Franz shouted, and Colonel Bordeaux immediately ran over. "Your Highness, the French must go it alone." "Go it alone?" Franz continued with some confusion. "Didn't they remember all the bumps they had yesterday?" "No, Your Highness. It looks like the French are planning to launch a general attack." "General attack?" Franz was a little curious, but he suddenly remembered Miss Fanny Coat yesterday. What? A madman? What does she think of street fighting? Playing house? This is the cruelest kind of fighting. Suddenly, the cheers and whistles became louder, and Fanny Coat appeared in front of the Orleans army in a military uniform with a solemn expression, a determined light in her light grey eyes, her short black hair fluttering in the wind, and a general's uniform. The officer's military uniform and the sword at his waist give people a heroic feeling. When Fanny Coat appeared, the soldiers of the Orleans Legion held their breath and the noise seemed to stop for an instant. The whistles of the German allied forces who were watching the battle became louder and louder. After all, women were rare animals in the army, and most soldiers had only seen them at the entrance of the military prostitute camp. Before the end of World War II, military prostitution camps were common in European countries, and France did not abolish the military prostitution system until after 1960. That's why the soldiers of the German allied forces were so excited when they saw a woman in military uniform. Of course, they were also curious about how that woman became a general. However, the Alsace Corps, which was deeply influenced by French culture, was much more solemn. After all, they knew that only women, dwarfs, and foreigners could save France. The high-ranking officials and dignitaries of the Allied Forces Command have a strong interest in it. In addition to their desire for beauty, wealthy aristocratic widows also have a fatal attraction for them. An aristocratic young man with oily hair and pink face suddenly took out a book of poems and recited, "Ah, how this lady shines on the battlefield at this moment. She reminds me of the charming moonlight. But the moon waxes and wanes, and my love for her only grows." Another elegant scum wearing gold-rimmed glasses crossed his legs and shook the red wine glass in his hand. "If that woman wins, I'll let her have dinner with me next Sunday night. It's really interesting. I was reading a very interesting book recently, and I was looking for someone to discuss it with." Several well-known playboys in the German Confederation, are doing their best to build momentum for themselves, while the socialites on the side have begun to make up the story of the Duchess killing her husband and father, and fooling around with the soldiers. Don't doubt the professionalism of these people. They study these things every day without doing anything else, and they naturally have it at their fingertips. However, Franz was not too interested in this kind of thing. Attacking the city was not an easy task. At this time, Fanny Coate was standing in a very dangerous position. Suddenly a gunshot rang out, and a bullet flew past her ear, knocking down a soldier in front of her. However, Fanny Coate did not panic, and continued her pre-war mobilization. This actually impressed Franz. When the French gunman looked out again, gunfire rang out, but this time it was the gunman who was shot. Fanny Coate looked in the direction of the coalition headquarters, and Franz waved. Although in Franz's eyes, Fanny Coate's behavior was no different than seeking death, he was willing to give this little widow from Orleans a chance to create a miracle. However, Franz was determined not to get involved in the French Civil War. After all, he still had at least 2 civil wars to fight, and he did not think anyone could puppet a great power like France. Fanny Coate looked in the direction of Franz and gritted her silver teeth bitterly. Although she had never attended a military school, she knew very well that the German Allied forces had hundreds of thousands of people, and that they were well equipped and had high fighting spirit. If the coalition forces want to annihilate the invaders in the city, it will definitely not be difficult. Fanny Coate received the order to conserve her strength and wait and see what happens, looking for opportunities to provoke the coalition forces and the rebels, referring to the Second French Republic, to carry out a larger scale attack. Decisive battle. But after she learned about the heroic deeds of the residents of Celesta City in resisting the French army, she could not wait for a moment. She wanted to liberate the city and drive away the invaders. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 998, The Noble Moth. Fighters of Orleans. From June 15th to now, the residents of Celesta City have been holding on for a full 17 days. Isn't the endless wasteland of ashes we walked through, and the ruins in front of us, enough to prove their loyalty? I've been here before. Celesta was a city full of energy and hope, but now it was wrapped in fear and despair. This great city is in desperate need of a helping hand. We came all the way here not just for the theater, let alone for the beer and sausages. Fanny Coate looked angrily in the direction of Franz. The latter picked up a piece of pork chop and waved it twice, then raised his coffee cup and saluted the former. Sure enough, the person being mirrored is not angry, but the person who is angry is the person who wants to mirror someone else. Fanny Coate's eyebrows were tightened, her silver teeth were gritted, the corners of her mouth were slightly drooped, a touch of determination was painted on her plump red lips, and her body leaned forward slightly, as if there was a fire burning in her chest. The rebels' atrocities will be punished. All invaders must pay the price for their actions. We must tell the residents of Celesta that they are not alone. We will serve as swords of light to pierce through this boundless darkness and bring them hope. With a stumble, Fanny Coate pulled out her command knife and shouted loudly, "Justice and courage are with us. For New Orleans. March forward." When he heard the words "for New Orleans," Franz almost couldn't hold back, and he secretly admired it in his heart. She is indeed the hostess of the Grand Salon in Paris. At least she doesn't have stage fright. However, this improvised army of the Orleans dynasty was really embarrassing. Not only did these soldiers have a variety of weapons, but they also wore a variety of uniforms. At least in the eyes of Franz and his staff, this miscellaneous army will soon flee like yesterday. After all, the casualties in street fighting are not something such a miscellaneous army can bear. The battle started just as Franz thought. This army encountered a big problem when it attacked the first street point, facing the French troops hiding behind bunkers and barricades. Fanny Coate's troops were helpless. Several attacks were organized, but each time they dispersed after leaving a dozen corpses behind. Franz had no interest in this kind of play-like battle. Just when he was about to do something more valuable, there was an exclamation from the direction of the battlefield. Fanny Coate stood on the route of the soldiers' retreat. She wanted to drive them back, but unfortunately the great principles she heard in the salon could not move them. In the end, Fanny Coat was pushed to the ground by a broken soldier. Fortunately, she was a woman, otherwise she might have been directly stabbed to death with a bayonet just now. Our heroine was knocked down. The playboy holding the poetry book joked, "See how she fell down very skillfully." The playboy wearing gold-rimmed glasses suggested that all the playboys in the German Allied forces would smile. "I feel bad that there was no bed where she fell. What if people like this one?" A burst of obscene laughter sounded. "Why do you guys, who only know sarcastic words, laugh at her?" An officer wearing a Bavarian military uniform, but bearing the insignia of the German Empire stood up. Vincent Morris was promoted to general by the Frankfurt National Assembly after the Battle of Brussels. Since most of the officers in this era were controlled by the nobility, the Frankfurt Parliament almost faced the dilemma of having no one available in the military. Vincent Morris was promoted from captain to major general in just 1 month, but the German imperial rank awarded by the National Assembly in Frankfurt was not recognized in this German coalition. How do you want to be a hero, little general? Those playboys who came from wealthy families did not take the general with shady background in their eyes. The ladies on the side were afraid that the men would not be able to fight. Why do you fall in love with that little widow? That kind of woman who shows off in front of the battle has been touched by countless people. Looking at your talent, do you want my sisters to help you introduce someone better? These men and women who spend all day living and drinking on the battlefield have long aroused the dissatisfaction of some soldiers. When they see their comrades being bullied by them, they can't help but stand up. You guys are the ones. Why are you so tyrannical? Are you really our own people? Who is the same as you mud-legged people? Don't take a piss and look in the mirror. We are born nobler than you mud-legged people in the mountains. The mud people in the mountains mean particularly lowly people. Who do you think is the mud man in the mountains? The playboy with gold-rimmed glasses clapped his hands bitterly. Guards, take them away. Several guards walked over with guns in hand, and the young officers did not show any weakness and immediately pulled out their own guns. Seeing that a gun battle was about to take place, suddenly a voice broke the deadlock. Hey, now take up your weapons and capture that neighborhood. Who are you? Who do you think you are? Several young men shouted back subconsciously. When they saw clearly that the person pointing at the battlefield was Franz, the voices of these so-called superior people immediately changed. Franz, I'm Fussen from Augsburg. I met you at the Taffy family dinner. The gentle scum wearing gold-rimmed glasses immediately got close to him, and several dog-looking guys on the side also lowered their heads. Several ladies looked at Franz intently, and some even held their chests, as if they were about to faint at any moment. The way it fell. Franz couldn't remember Fussen of Augsburg, nor could Bordeaux, who was an aide-de-camp. Finally, his secretary Mauritius reminded him that this was a branch of the Augsburg family, the fifth heir of the branch. But this kind of thing is not important to Franz at all. He just feels that it is necessary to punish these people appropriately. Then, sir, I now order you to take these friends of yours and the guards to capture that neighborhood. Do you understand? The young masters were immediately frightened to death, but they still pretended to be dumbfounded and just scolded their men to go to the battlefield while they wanted to take the opportunity to escape. You're going the wrong way, Franz reminded. We are the commanders. They need us to sit in the rear and command. Only in this way can we use our talents. Don't you understand? I want you to pick up your guns and go to the battlefield. Franz roared angrily, and the officers, who were obviously not from the same group as them, all grabbed their rifles and walked towards the battlefield. Vincent Morris whispered as he walked past the playboys. Come on, let me see if the bullet can bypass your noble body. The noble young men did not dare to reply and lowered their heads. They were afraid of meeting Franz's eyes and causing greater trouble. The ladies on the side let out a burst of excited screams. Chapter 999 Charge. Archduke Franz, we will die on the battlefield. We are nobles. Ah, you nobles? Aren't the people who stopped the retreating troops on the front line aristocrats? Are there not many nobles among the frontline commanders of our army? These Before the playboys had time to argue, Franz continued. 6. You only know pleasure, are greedy for life and fear death, and make trouble everywhere. You only want to enjoy the benefits of power, but are unwilling to bear the responsibilities of being a noble. You call them bullshit nobles. You have disgraced the nobles. Pick up a gun and go to the battlefield to prove that you are not cowards, or else get out of the coalition forces, stay at home, and don't let me see you again. As expected, all these playboys ran away in the opposite direction of the battlefield. How could the dynasty not decline when there were such corpse-like people everywhere? Franz forcefully resolved an internal crisis among men, but the ladies did not learn his lesson. They walked arm in arm to Franz's tent cabin, holding parasols on the other side of the battlefield in Celesta. Fanny Coat got up from the ground and silently walked towards an Orleans military flag that had been left on the ground. She took off her gloves and held the flagpole with her white jade fingers, then raised the Orleans army flag high above her head and waved it vigorously. Brave warriors of Orleans, charge with me. Fanny Coat did not look back, but rushed straight to the French barricade. The French skirmisher behind the barricade was looking at his commander with questioning eyes. After all, the other officer was both an officer and a nobleman. He did not carry a thermal weapon. According to the rules, he could not shoot her with a gun. However, the French colonel on the front line obviously did not want to abide by this so-called rule. Mr. D'Angela said that any means is reasonable to deal with the remnants of the Orleans dynasty. The colonel added, don't kill me. The military prostitute camp still needs a good horse. The soldiers on the side all laughed obscenely. They were the happiest they had been in these days, and they laughed even more wildly when they thought that they might be able to participate in the sideshow at night. But soon the unpleasant scream sounded again. It's an Austrian rocket. Hide. This time the French army went to Alsace to fight extremely hard. First the citizens of Celesta who refused to surrender, and then the mercenaries who wanted money rather than their lives. I wanted to replenish some supplies on the spot, rob on the spot, but the nearby unruly people actually turned the surrounding area into a sea of fire. Continuous street fighting was like a flesh and blood mill, destroying the lives and spirits of French soldiers. Then something even more terrifying came. Reinforcement from the German allied forces were like locusts all over the mountains and plains. Along with them came these rockets and heavy artillery, and the continuous explosions were heard, and the already dilapidated ruins were blown into even more tatters. Earth chips and wood chips continued to fall from the ruins of the walls, raising a cloud of smoke and dust in front of the French army's position, causing the French soldiers to cough repeatedly. When the smoke cleared, the French soldiers were horrified to find that the enemy had rushed in front of them. Not just the crazy woman, but also countless roaring angry men. In fact, the French at this time did not lack blood, they just lacked appropriate spurs and leaders. Although Fanny Coat is very serious, she is indeed a layman. There is no supervising team in her army, and the bounty provided by Louis Philippe is obviously not enough to make people sacrifice their lives. Fanny Coat and her flag had just taken the lead, and her charge really stimulated the pride of the men. After all, letting a 19-year-old widow take the lead made those big men feel that they were disgraced. In addition to the Orleans army in Alsace, there were also some other soldiers from the German allied forces in the charging team. After all, if we were to fight the French, there would be many people willing to help. Of course, Franz's artillery support also played a role in fueling the flames. Although Franz didn't intend to attack by force, he would not lose any face by betraying him. The lackeys of the Orleans dynasty are coming. Hold it. Hold it. The French major who had just inspected the front line was trapped in the front line by artillery fire. The rebels who were still weak just now were already in front of them. In panic, he had forgotten his original mission, kick the rebels from our land. Soldiers from both sides shouted "Long live France," and then fought with each other. The colonel from the Second French Republic wanted to escape, but the screams behind him made him turn back instinctively. At this time, a pointed spear penetrated directly through his lower body. Just as he was about to scream, the spear penetrated his throat. Fanny Coat gasped and pulled out the royal flag of Orleans. She also played tennis and polo as usual, otherwise running with the flag would have exhausted her energy. But Fanny Coat was not going to rest. She wanted to rush into Celesta today. Soldiers, don't rest. We are going to liberate Celesta today. Enough red wine and steak for tonight. I'll give it to you. Come on. Red wine, steak, etc. are not important. What is important is that someone invites you. At this moment, these patchwork militiamen finally turned into an army that dared to fight and charge. However, the Duchess obviously had a problem with her sense of direction. While shouting for the liberation of Celesta, she led the audience and German troops in a chaotic charge. There is also the advantage of rushing indiscriminately, because the already scattered French army could not transmit intelligence in time. Many French troops were still behind the barricades to defend against the German allied attack. Suddenly Fanny Coat came out from behind the barricades. In addition, according to the intelligence returned from the reconnaissance hot air balloon, the French army seemed to have been planning a military operation, but it was completely disrupted by Fanny Coat. At this time, the French army and Fanny Coat in the entire city of Celesta were running around like headless flies. However, one side wanted to fight, the other wanted to run away, and under the influence of the other, the army led by Bonodi Cullen, the French army was completely defeated. With victory in sight, all parties began to take action. Allied forces joined the battlefield one after another. Celesta's defenders also took the opportunity to launch a counterattack. Naturally, Franz would not miss the opportunity. When the Austrian army joined the battlefield, the French army completely lost hope. The defense of Celesta, which lasted 18 days, finally ended on July 1, 1848. The total casualties of the French army were as high as 58,000, and another 30,000 were captured. Bonodi Cullen escaped from the encirclement with less than 2,000 people, of which Franz was indispensable. Franz did not let the German allied forces go deep into France to continue the pursuit, but divided them into 3 parts. One part was stationed at the border to prevent the French from coming back. Part of them helped rebuild their homes, and the rest were sent to other battlefields. After all, there was no need for so many people on the Celesta battlefield. The reason why so many troops were concentrated was entirely due to political considerations and to prevent unexpected situations from happening. Chapter 1000 Burning the Coffin to celebrate the victory. The hasty ending of the Battle of Celesta was completely unexpected by Franz, but the supplies carried by the army should be just enough for nearby residents to use until winter. In fact, before the battle ended, Franz had always believed that Duchess Fanny Coat would most likely die in a certain alley, and the rest of the Orleans army would disperse, or be inspired to fight for a while, before taking the Duchess with him. Body comes back. Franz even prepared a eulogy and a fine coffin. Yet Fanny Coat survived and emerged victorious. According to post-war statistics, no senior officers of the coalition forces were killed in action, so this coffin was immediately useless. Coffins also have levels, and using them indiscriminately will not only cause unnecessary arguments, but may even lead to unnecessary comparisons. There are naturally heroes who died in battle, and even if Franz didn't exist, some would be created, but these heroes are even less suitable for use beyond the limit. The heroes should only be transported back to their country with their ashes, military uniforms and merit medals. This is a helpless move to prevent enemies or third parties from taking the corpses and demanding a price. There has never been a shortage of corpse thieves and tooth hunters on the European battlefield. These two professions have been popularized before, so I won't go into details, but as long as the value of the corpse is high enough, someone will definitely choose to take risks. In the anti-French war, many times during the anti-French war, the two sides were enemies during the day, but they were colleagues stealing corpses together at night. Even if countries impose the most stringent criminal laws on corpse theft, this lucrative industry cannot be cut off. In addition to the gold, silver, and jewelry carried by the corpse itself, clothes, weapons, hair, teeth, carrion, and even bones can be exchanged for money. Wigs and fake beards have always been the favorites of the upper class. In this era of rough food and no daily protection for teeth, the demand for dentures has always been high. Not only can carrion be used as fertilizer, but bones can also be burned into bone char, which is used by sugar factories as a decolorizing filter to process raw sugar into white sugar. The British are particularly experienced in this regard. The editor-in-chief of a certain newspaper once publicly declared in the newspaper, "It is estimated that more than 1 million bushels 1 bushel is equal to 8 gallons in the UK, of human and non-human bones were imported into the port of Hull from mainland Europe last year. They come from near Leipzig, Austerlitz and Waterloo, are ground into granules on Yorkshire bone grinders, made into bone fertilizer, and sent to the largest agricultural markets, where they are then sold to farmers according to research by our country's experts. Human bones can produce the best quality fertilizer. There is no doubt that dead soldiers were still valuable commodities, and it is incomprehensible that Yorkshire farmers relied to a large extent on the bones of their children for their daily bread. At this moment, there are actually corpse thieves starting to take action, but Franz has already prepared a team of professional body pickers. Most of them are refugees from Ireland. Many of these people cannot even speak English. They only know ancient Gaelic. Businessmen who want to bribe them need to hire a special translator. Moreover, these Irish people have a special organization. Anyone who wants to contact them and get close to them can easily find out. Franz, if we don't eliminate the upstream industrial chain and just try to catch some temporary workers, this trend will never end. In addition, the cost of disposing of corpses is relatively low for Irish refugees. If other ethnic groups in Austria are used, it will easily cause criticism, but Irish people do not need to worry about these problems. As for the issue of self-incarceration, the Irish as refugees are also more susceptible to more stringent inspections in terms of punishment. Franz did not have to worry about being criticized by the nobles and some opinion leaders due to excessive punishment. Even if something really goes wrong, Franz can always blame all the blame on the British. After all, the Irish are from Britain. The body pickers will first dig out the corpses of the German allied forces under the leadership of priests, then hold simple masses, and cremate them one by one, and finally seal them, and bring them back to the country. The corpses of the Celesta residents will be returned to the Celesta people, while the corpses of the French soldiers will be gathered together. Whether to bury or burn them will be decided by the Celesta residents and representatives of the Orleans dynasty. As for the coffin and the eulogy, Franz was going to use them as fuel to hold a bonfire party. What Franz didn't know was that his behavior had been overinterpreted. Have you heard? Archduke Franz actually went to the battlefield with a coffin. Really? Didn't you see it when the quartermaster passed by the camp with that coffin today? Is that for Archduke Franz? I didn't believe it at first, but after the news of the victory came back, Archduke Franz ordered the coffin to be chopped into pieces. That's all fine wood. You can never afford it in your life. Why should such good wood be chopped as firewood? What a waste. Can't we use it next time? The soldier's head was hit hard, and the meddling veteran roared angrily. Is it auspicious for you to use a coffin? Are you thinking that Archduke Franz, like you, can't live in a coffin, sleep or get up? You can take a broken coffin with you wherever you go. Then, why should it be used as firewood? Zyobing still couldn't accept that the good wood was wasted like this. Didn't you hear that there is going to be a celebration party? I heard about it. They even gave me a bottle of wine and a piece of salted fish. Zyobing smacked his lips while counting. That salted fish is really good. Do you think all the big shots are the same as you? Are you satisfied with just one salted fish? Archduke Franz is going to host a bonfire party for representatives from various states tonight. Have a bonfire party using a coffin as firewood. Aren't you afraid? Zyobing couldn't help but complained, but then he received another chestnut from the veteran. What? Do you know? The aristocratic men in the city like to play exciting things. Burning coffins and having bonfire parties is nothing. The British royal family also eats human flesh for a feast. At this point, a man wearing a white robe with a Bible and coat stood up. As the preacher accompanying the army, Ace naturally knew the role of rumors, so he immediately began to correct the deviating style, carrying a coffin to go into battle, and then burning the coffin to celebrate after a great victory. How can such heroic things make you sound so petty? The preacher is a type of chaplain in the Austrian army, but he has both a church and a military identity, and can even directly deal with low-level non-commissioned officers who have made mistakes. In addition, the two soldiers had no intention of discrediting Franz, so they immediately changed their words. Yes, carrying the coffin to the battle, burning the coffin to celebrate. You are so heroic. Archduke Franz is mighty. Remember, there is only one version If I hear other rumors, I guarantee that you will die without a burial place. Yes. Yes, yes. The two soldiers were about to leave. Return, master. Priest, do you have any other orders? The pork chops are about to be fried. Let's stay and eat together. The two soldiers gratefully shared the delicious fried pork chops with the priest, but Sister Ruby on the side was a little unhappy. The rare time the brother and sister spent together was ruined. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.